The past is never gone. It waits for us in the mist.
The Barrancoid culture, they left behind fragments of pottery, faint traces of settlements, and echoes of rituals lost to time. Yet the people themselves, their voices, their myths, their fate remain elusive. This is the story of the Barrancoid culture, emerging along the lower Orinoco River in what is now Venezuela. The Barrancoid people flourished between roughly 500 BCE and 500 CE. Their world was one of winding waterways, dense forests, and fertile floodplains. Here, among the riverbanks, they built a culture that left a distinctive imprint across northern South America and the Caribbean. Archaeologists first began piecing together their presence through ceramics. Pottery shards, often decorated with intricate incised lines and painted patterns, offered glimpses into both daily life and ceremonial practice. The vessels were not simply utilitarian. Their designs reflected a sense of identity, artistry, and perhaps even spiritual meaning. Some bear geometric motifs, while others suggest stylized representations of animals or spirits. These patterns would become a hallmark of Barrancoid craftsmanship, and a clue that linked distant communities across vast waterways. The Orinoco River, stretching over 2,000 kilometers, was not only a source of sustenance, but also a natural highway. The Barrancoid people are thought to have mastered riverine navigation, traveling and trading along its tributaries. Evidence of their pottery has been found far from its point of origin, suggesting a network of exchange that carried both goods and ideas. It is here that the story of the Barrancoid culture takes an intriguing turn. Their ceramics and cultural influence appear not only along the Orinoco, but also deep into the Caribbean islands. Archaeological excavations in Trinidad, Tobago, and the Lesser Antilles reveal artifacts with clear Barrancoid connections. This raises questions: were the Barrancoid among the early voyagers who brought mainland traditions into the islands? Did they expand through migration, or through a diffusion of styles and rituals carried by trade? The evidence suggests a society comfortable with mobility, their river canoes cutting through water, their traditions traveling with them. But what those traditions were, exactly, remains harder to define. Archaeologists have long speculated about the ceremonial role of Barrancoid pottery. Some vessels, carefully shaped and elaborately decorated, seem intended for ritual use rather than for storage or cooking. The placement of these artifacts in burial contexts hints at beliefs surrounding the afterlife. It is possible that the Barrancoid viewed death not as an ending, but as a passage requiring offerings, symbols, and protection. Their settlements, however, are less well understood. Unlike some contemporaneous cultures that left monumental architecture or large-scale earthworks, the Barrancoid footprint is subtle. Excavations point to riverbank villages, likely built with organic materials that have long since decayed. The lack of surviving structures makes it difficult to reconstruct their social hierarchy, political organization, or population size. What we do know comes largely from the trail of pottery and the faint outlines of interaction. By comparing Barrancoid artifacts to those of neighboring groups, archaeologists can trace shifts in influence, competition, and cultural blending. For instance, after around 500 CE, the distinctive style of Barrancoid ceramics begins to fade, replaced by other traditions, such as the Araquinoid complex, that spread across the same region. This transition raises yet another question: what became of the Barrancoid people? Some scholars suggest they were absorbed into larger cultural systems, their traditions gradually transformed by contact and intermarriage. Others propose a more dramatic shift, where environmental pressures or social upheaval disrupted their way of life. Flooding, droughts, or shifts in trade routes could have altered the delicate balance of riverine living. Whatever the cause, the Barrancoid culture, once widespread, began to dissolve into the currents of history, and yet their legacy persists. The ceramic styles they developed show continuity in later groups, echoing in patterns that stretch from the mainland to the islands. In this way, the Barrancoid story is not one of disappearance, but of transformation. Their influence lived on, carried by the movements of people who followed the same rivers, crossed the same seas, and inherited fragments of their worldview. Still, mysteries remain. Did the Barrancoid have a complex system of religious belief, perhaps tied to river spirits or celestial cycles? Were there migrations to the Caribbean, intentional voyages of exploration, or gradual drifts of families seeking new lands? And how much of what we see in their pottery is artistic expression versus coded messages, symbols of identity, or ritual markers? The Barrancoid culture reminds us of how much of human history lies in fragment shards of pottery, traces of settlements, echoes carried by water. We may never hear their stories in their own words, but through careful study we begin to glimpse their presence. A people who lived between rivers and seas, who connected distant lands through craft and travel, and whose fate is still half hidden. In the soils of the Orinoco, perhaps the most compelling aspect of the Barrancoid mystery is not what we know, but what remains unanswered. In the silence of the rainforest and the slow currents of the river, their past lingers like an echo waiting, perhaps, for another fragment to surface, another clue to bring us closer. Until then, the Barrancoid remained both present and absent, a culture defined by what it left behind, and by the questions it continues to ask of us. The Aclanan civilization beneath the shadow of the Philippine archipelago. In the windswept plains and coastal landscapes of Aclana, traces of an ancient people linger, silent markers of a civilization whose roots extend far deeper than colonial memory allows. This is the story of the Aclanan civilization, a culture shaped by sea and mountain, remembered in fragments, and still cloaked in mystery. For centuries, Aclan has been known as a province of the Visayas, home to the Ati festival, winding rivers, and fertile lands. But long before Spanish chroniclers arrived in the 16th century, this place was already inhabited by a people with their own language, rituals, and systems of governance. The Aclanan were not a passive community awaiting discovery. They were active participants in trade networks, spiritual practices, and the complex tapestry of pre-colonial Southeast Asia. The first clues to their existence are embedded in language itself. Aclanan, one of the Visayan tongues, is unique for its distinctive phonetics, most famously, the so-called closed L sound, a phoneme not found elsewhere in the archipelago. Linguists argue that this feature points to deep, independent roots, perhaps evidence of an older stratum of migration or an enduring link to ancestral populations. The language, still spoken today, carries with it centuries of preserved thought and identity, an audible echo of the civilization that bore it. Archaeological findings strengthen the story. In caves and burial sites scattered across Panay Island, artifacts have been unearthed: pottery shards, shell ornaments, tools fashioned from stone and metal. These fragments reveal a society that blended local resources with far-reaching connections. Chinese porcelain from the Song and Ming dynasties, beads from India, and other trade goods suggest that the Aclanan people were not isolated. They were part of a maritime world in which ships carried both goods and ideas across the South China Sea. But perhaps the most enduring cultural thread lies in the oral traditions of Panay. The Maragdas epic, though controversial in its historicity, tells of the legendary 10 daters who fled Borneo and settled in Panay. According to the tale, these leaders negotiated with the Atitha Islands' indigenous inhabitants for the lowland plains, offering gold and gifts in exchange. Some historians dismiss the narrative as myth, while others argue that it encodes real memories of migration and settlement. If the story carries even a kernel of truth, then the Aclanan civilization may represent the descendants of that formative encounter, a blending of newcomers and natives, whose identities merged into something distinct, yet their social organization remains largely in shadow. Spanish documents describe barangays led by datas, with trade-based economies and kinship networks. But what of the centuries before European arrival? Did the Aclanan possess centralized political structures, or were they bound together by shifting alliances of kinship and trade? Archaeology suggests settlements of varying scale, from riverside communities to coastal hubs, but the absence of monumental architecture leaves questions about hierarchy unanswered. Ritual life, however, emerges more vividly. The Aclanan are remembered for ceremonies tied to agriculture, fertility, and the natural world. The Atiatahan festival, celebrated to this day, is rooted in pre-colonial rituals that honored ancestral spirits and invoked protection. Dancers smeared their bodies with soot, imitating the Ati and recalling an ancient pact of peace between peoples, though later overlaid with Christian symbolism. The festival's older layers point to a civilization deeply engaged with nature, memory, and identity. Music and oral poetry further illuminate this unseen world. Traditional Ambahan and Sugadanan chants, recited in a Klanan language, reveal values of courage, kinship, and cosmic order. These performances were not mere entertainment. They were vessels of knowledge, binding generations through rhythm and story. Each line preserved fragments of myth and worldview, painting a picture of a people whose history was carried not in stone, but in the living voice. And yet, so much remains elusive. While neighboring regions of the Philippines have yielded extensive archaeological digs, the pre-colonial layers of Aklan remain only lightly studied. How extensive were their trading networks? Did they sail beyond Panay to settle in other islands, leaving linguistic and cultural imprints across the vicinity? Or were they a localized society, whose influence spread primarily through ritual and exchange? The disappearance of clear archaeological traces adds to the mystery. Unlike civilizations that built massive temples or left carved inscriptions, the Aklanan lived in structures of bamboo and nipa, which the tropical climate has long since erased. Their writing system, if they used one, has vanished. What remains are the shadows, pottery fragments, oral traditions, and a language that stubbornly holds on to its unique sounds. Historians face a dilemma. Do they reconstruct the Aklanan civilization through the lens of neighboring Visayan groups, assuming parallels, or do they treat the surviving evidence as a sign of something distinct, a culture whose uniqueness has yet to be fully appreciated? In this tension lies the enigma of the Aklanan present, yet half hidden. The colonial era brought abrupt transformation. With Spanish arrival in the 16th century, the Aklanan way of life was folded into the broader framework of Christianized villages, tribute systems, and enforced labor. Rituals were reinterpreted through Catholicism. Political authority was restructured, and written records began to favor colonial perspectives over local voices. What survived was refracted through change, leaving the deeper origins obscured. But even through these disruptions, the Aklanan identity endured. Today, their language is spoken by more than 500,000 people. Their festivals, though reshaped, still carry echoes of ancient pacts and performances. Their oral epics, recorded in the 20th century, preserve stories that may reach back to times before Spanish sails ever appeared on the horizon. It is this continuity, despite centuries of erasure, that gives the Aklanan civilization its mystery. Unlike vanished empires or ruined cities, the Aklanan are still here. Their culture alive, yet threaded with unanswered questions about its beginnings. They stand as both present-day people and guardians of an ancient story that refuses to be fully uncovered. What remains then is a sense of incompleteness. The soil of Panay may yet hold further evidence, tools, ornaments, even settlements that could rewrite what we know. Oral traditions may still conceal historical truths beneath layers of poetry and myth, and the language itself, with its singular sounds, may be the oldest relic of all a living artifact that carries the memory of migration, survival, and adaptation. The Aklanan civilization reminds us that not all mysteries are buried ruins or lost cities. Some are hidden in the voices of the living, in the rituals repeated year after year, in the quiet endurance of a people who have carried their identity across centuries of change. And as the drums of Atihan still echo through Aklan streets, one cannot help but wonder how much of that sound belongs to the present and how much is the heartbeat of a civilization whose origins still lie, waiting, in the shadows of time. The Tagalog Barangay on the rivers and shores of ancient Luzon. Long before the Spanish conquest, clusters of settlements thrived. They were called barangay, small, tightly knit communities led by local rulers. To the outside eye, they may have seemed modest, yet within these barangays, the foundations of Tagalog society were laid, a civilization both resilient and enigmatic, whose traces still ripple through the Philippines today. The Tagalog barangays were not empires in the monumental sense. They left behind no towering pyramids or grand stone cities. Instead, their legacy is etched into oral traditions, Spanish chronicles, and the fragile remains of a world built with bamboo, wood, and thatch materials that the tropical climate has long since reclaimed. And yet, these barangays formed a complex society, politically organized, economically active, spiritually rich, and mysteriously fluid in their alliances and identities. At the center of each barangay stood the Dotu. This leader was not a distant monarch, but a figure deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, warrior, judge, and chief. The barangay itself likely derived its name from the balangay, a large wooden boat. Some scholars believe this suggests the origins of these communities lay in seafaring migrations, where kinship groups settled new coasts after long voyages. Whether literal or symbolic, the image of the boat captures the essence of the barangay: mobile, adaptive, bound together by ties of loyalty and necessity. A typical Tagalog barangay numbered between 30 and 100 households, yet these numbers belie a subtle complexity. Social hierarchy was firmly in place. At the top were the Maganutha noble class. Below them, the Tamawa freemen, who could own land and serve as warriors. At the base were the Alapin bondsmen, who labored for their masters but whose status was not necessarily permanent. One could rise, through loyalty or service, to higher standing. It was a society that balanced kinship with stratification, giving order to small-scale yet structured communities. The geography of the barangays was deliberate. Settlements clustered along rivers, lakes, and coastal shores. The Pasig River, for instance, was a lifeline for Tagalog barangays. It connected Laguna de Bay with Maynila Bay, serving as both a source of livelihood and a trade route. Through these waterways, the Tagalog engaged in commerce that extended far beyond their villages. Archaeological finds tell the story. Chinese porcelain, beads from India, iron tools, and gold ornaments. These objects point to vibrant trade networks that stretched across Southeast Asia. The Tagalog were not isolated. They were participants in a world of exchange. Gold, in particular, played a central role in their culture. Early Spanish observers marveled at the abundance of gold ornaments among Tagalog nobles' earrings, necklaces, and even weapon hilts. To the Tagalog, gold was more than wealth. It was status, identity, and spiritual power. Some burial sites have revealed individuals interred with gold masks and jewelry, suggesting beliefs in an afterlife where such adornments continued to hold meaning. Religion and ritual further defined Tagalog life. They believed in a pantheon of deities, with Pathela as the supreme god, accompanied by spirits tied to nature, fertility, and daily survival. The Babylon, or spiritual leader, often a woman, conducted rituals to heal, predict the future, and mediate with the unseen. These practices, blending animism with reverence for ancestors, infused daily life with a sense of cosmic order. Yet, the details of these beliefs are fragmentary, filtered through the accounts of Spanish friars who often misunderstood or condemned them. The full richness of Tagalog spirituality remains just out of reach. Warfare and alliance were constants. Barangays frequently engaged in pangail or raids, both for resources and prestige. Yet they also formed alliances, bound by marriage, trade, or shared defense. Unlike large centralized states, the Tagalog barangays were fluid, their loyalties shifting with circumstance. This fluidity may have been their strength, allowing adaptability, but it was also a weakness when confronted with the centralized and persistent power of colonial Spain. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they encountered a patchwork of barangays across Luzon, each with its own dotu, its own networks, and its own rivalries. The Spaniards quickly exploited these divisions. In some places, they forged alliances. In others, they imposed conquest. The barangay system was not destroyed but absorbed, reshaped into the colonial structure of pueblos and datos became cabezas de barangay. Local leaders, under Spanish authority, what had once been independent polities, were transformed into administrative units. Yet the memory of the barangay remained, embedded in the Tagalog identity. And here lies the mystery. For all the details we have, the hierarchy, the trade, the rituals, much about the Tagalog barangays is still obscured. Did some barangay grow larger, perhaps foreshadowing more centralized states? How far did their maritime voyages extend? And what of their oral epics, their myths and genealogies, only fragments of which survive? The lack of written records leaves us with shadows, reconstructed from the outside. Still, the barangay endures. Today, the term remains in the Philippines as the smallest unit of government. Millions of Filipinos live in barangays, a modern echo of an ancient system. Yet the modern barangay is administrative, bureaucratic. The pre-colonial barangay was something different, a community bound by loyalty, tradition, and the ceaseless flow of river and sea. The Tagalog barangays remind us that civilization does not always mean towering monuments or sprawling empires. Sometimes it is the quieter structures, clusters of families, networks of trade, rituals performed at dusk, that shape a people's history. Their story is one of resilience in smallness, of complexity hidden in simplicity, of a civilization whose traces are subtle but enduring. And as the rivers of Luzon continue to flow, carrying boats much like those that first carried the Barrancoid, we are left with questions still unanswered. What secrets lie beneath the soil, or in forgotten chants, or in stories never written down? Perhaps the Tagalog barangays are not a lost world at all, but a reminder that history's deepest currents often run quietly, just beneath the surface. The Magyas Confederation on the island of Panay, in the heart of the Visayas, legends speak of a confederation that rose from the shores of the 13th century. It is known as the Magyas Confederation, a polity that exists somewhere between history and myth, carried in epic chants, oral memory, and the earliest chronicles of the Philippines. Was it a true kingdom, with laws and rulers, or a symbolic tale, woven to explain identity and origin? The answers lie in fragments, scattered across centuries. The story begins with the Maragdas. This epic, compiled in the early 20th century, but rooted in older oral traditions, recounts how 10 datas from Borneo fled the rule of a tyrant and sailed northward across the seas. They landed on Panay, where they encountered the Ati, the island's earliest inhabitants. According to the tale, the datas negotiated peace with the Ati chieftain Marikda, purchasing lowland territories in exchange for gifts of gold, cloth, and jewelry. From this pact, the Magyas Confederation was born. For generations, the story has been told as both history and legend. Some historians argue that it encodes a real migration, a memory of waves of settlers from Borneo who mingled with local peoples. Others caution that the Maragdas was never meant as literal history, but as symbolic narrative, blending folklore with fragments of fact. Still, the idea of Magyas as a confederation of barangays, bound by kinship and shared rule, remains deeply embedded in Visayan identity. What might this confederation have looked like, if it truly existed? Accounts suggest that Magyas was not a centralized kingdom in the mold of great Asian empires. Rather, it may have been a loose alliance of barangays, led by datas, who governed their own domains, but recognized bonds of cooperation. This flexibility would have suited a maritime world, where power flowed along rivers and coasts, where alliances shifted with trade, marriage, and warfare. Evidence hints that the communities of Panay were far from isolated. Chinese porcelain, beads from India, and gold ornaments have been unearthed in the region, pointing to vibrant trade networks. Panay's fertile river valleys and coastal settlements made it a hub for both agriculture and commerce. It is plausible that Magyas was not only a political confederation, but also an economic one, linking inland and coastal communities in a network of exchange. Yet the boundaries between fact and legend blur most vividly in the story of their rulers. The Maragdas names Datu Puti, Datu Smakwel, and others as leaders who established law and order in Panay. Datu Smakwel in particular is said to have framed codes of conduct that guided justice and governance. Some scholars suggest these may reflect real customary laws, later remembered through epic tradition. Others see them as retroactive ideals, projecting order onto a distant past. Ritual life added another dimension. The Magyas Confederation is remembered in chants like the Hinilawad, one of the longest epic poems in the world, performed in the highlands of Panay. The Hinilawad tells of heroes, battles, and journeys that stretch into the cosmic, though mythic in content. The performance itself, passed down orally through generations, anchors the memory of a people who saw themselves as heirs to a grand tradition. It suggests that, whether historical or legendary, Magyas lived in the consciousness of its descendants. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century brought new layers to this story. By then, the Magyas Confederation, if it ever functioned as a political body, had already faded or transformed. Spanish chroniclers mention datas and settlements in Panay, but not a centralized confederation. Instead, they encountered a mosaic of barangays similar to those of Luzon and other islands. The absence of direct reference to Magyas has fueled skepticism. Was it ever more than legend, or had centuries of change eroded its political structure before the Spaniards arrived? Still, tantalizing fragments remain. Linguistic patterns suggest migrations from Borneo did shape the peoples of Panay. Archaeological finds confirm that Panay was a thriving center of trade and settlement long before European contact. Oral traditions like the Maragdas and Hini preserve names, places, and events too specific to be dismissed outright. The truth may lie somewhere in between, a memory of alliances and migrations, later magnified into legend. Even the name Madyaz carries a hint of mystery. It may derive from an old Visayan word meaning lofty or noble. If so, the Confederation's title reflects not only political ambition but also a sense of pride and elevated identity. To its descendants, Madyaz symbolized more than governance. It was a declaration of heritage. The question of Madyaz, then, is not only historical but symbolic. Did it exist as a political entity, with codified laws and a council of datas, or is it best understood as a cultural memory, a story told to explain how communities came to be, how order emerged from migration and settlement? Either way, the Confederation holds meaning. It bridges myth and history, embodying both the literal and the imagined past of the Visayan people. Today, the legacy of Madyaz lives on in Aklan, Iloilo, Capiz, and Antique, provinces that make up Panay. The Ati-Atihan festival, though Christianized, still recalls the ancient pact with the Ati-oral epics continue to be performed. Their verses carrying fragments of pre-colonial thought, and the idea of Madyaz still inspires, whether as ancestral memory or as a symbol of resilience and unity. What remains elusive are the hard details, the settlements themselves, the artifacts of rulers, the written laws that might confirm the legends. Perhaps they lie buried beneath Panay's soil, awaiting discovery, or perhaps they were never there, existing only in the imaginations of storytellers who sought to weave meaning from the past. The Madyaz Confederation endures as one of the Philippines' greatest enigmas, a tale of 10 datas of alliances and codes, of trade and ritual, half history, half myth. It challenges us to ask what it means to remember, and how societies preserve their origins. And as the epic chants of Panay still echo in the voices of storytellers, we are left with the lingering question: was Madyaz a kingdom lost to time, or a story that has always belonged to the realm of legend? The Rajahnates of Butuan, the mouth of the Agasan River in northern Mindanao, where the waters meet the sea, an ancient kingdom once thrived. Known to history as the Rajahnates of Butuan, it was a center of trade, diplomacy, and maritime power. Today, its memory survives only in fragments, gold ornaments, carved boats, and the scattered words of foreign chroniclers. But together, these fragments paint a picture of one of the earliest and most intriguing polities in the Philippines. The story of Butuan begins not in legend, but in the records of distant lands. As early as the 10th century, Chinese documents mentioned Butuan as a prosperous kingdom. The Song Shi, the official history of China's Song dynasty, describes how in the year 1001, emissaries from Butuan arrived at the imperial court. They brought tribute tortoise-shells, pearls, and fragrant woods and were recognized by the emperor as representatives of a foreign state. This was no small event. To be recorded in the annals of the Song court meant that Butuan had secured a place in the web of international diplomacy. What kind of kingdom was it that could send ambassadors across the sea? Archaeology offers clues. Butuan is renowned for its wealth in gold. Excavations in the region have uncovered an astonishing array of artifacts, masks, diadems, ornaments, and ritual objects, all fashioned with extraordinary craftsmanship. These finds reveal not only wealth, but a highly developed culture of metallurgy, one capable of producing intricate designs and symbolic forms. Gold was not merely adornment, it was power, prestige, and a link between the earthly and the divine. Equally remarkable are the boats of Butuan. In the 1970s and 1980s, archaeologists discovered the Barangay boats, large wooden vessels buried along the banks of the Lapita area. Dated to as early as the 4th century, these boats testify to a maritime tradition of astonishing skill. Each was built with planks, lashed together by dowels and fiber, sturdy enough to cross open seas. The Barangay was more than a vessel. It was a symbol of community and mobility, carrying goods, warriors, and emissaries across the waters. It is no coincidence that the word barangay, the fundamental social unit in the Philippines, shares the same root. From these discoveries emerges an image of Butuan as a thalassocracy, a kingdom of the sea. Its strength lay not in monumental architecture or vast armies, but in its ability to command the rivers and coasts, to trade across islands, and to reach as far as China. Some scholars suggest that Butuan may have served as an intermediary hub, channeling goods from the southern seas toward the northern routes of Asia. Yet, the Rajahnates' spiritual and political life remains shadowy. The title, Raja itself, hints at Indian influence, part of the wider currents of Hindu-Buddhist culture that spread across Southeast Asia. Did Butuan's rulers adopt Indianized systems of kingship, complete with rituals of divine kingship, or was the term Raja later applied by outsiders to describe leadership that was more local in form? The evidence is fragmentary, leaving us to speculate. One intriguing glimpse comes from the Butuan silver paleograph, a thin strip of metal, inscribed with ancient script, possibly dating from the 12th or 13th century. Though still undeciphered, it suggests that Butuan had its own system of writing, linking it to the broader tradition of Indic scripts that once spread across the region. If fully understood, this artifact might reveal details of governance, ritual, or law, yet, for now, it remains mute. What we do know is that Butuan commanded respect. In 1011, Raja, king of Butuan, sent another envoy to China, bearing gifts of camphor and requesting recognition. The Song court granted him the title of king, affirming his status among the rulers of Asia. At this moment, Butuan was no provincial outpost. It was an acknowledged state, standing in the company of Champa, Srivijaya, and other maritime polities, but power in Southeast Asia was fluid, and dominance often shrank. By the 11th century, Butuan's prominence began to wane. Chinese records after the mid-1100s no longer mention its envoys. Instead, attention shifted to other centers of trade and power, such as Cebu and Sulu. Some scholars suggest that the rise of rival kingdoms drew commerce away from Butuan. Others argue that natural changes, the silting of rivers, shifts in trade winds may have reduced its role. Whatever the cause, the Rajahnates of Butuan slipped gradually into obscurity. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they encountered not a thriving kingdom but a region fragmented into smaller communities. Yet even then, the memory of Butuan's golden age lingered. Early Spanish accounts speak of people adorned with gold, their rulers commanding loyalty, their past remembered in stories, but the grandeur of Butuan as a diplomatic power was no more. Today, the enigma of the Rajahnates endures. Its gold artifacts, many preserved in museums, dazzle with artistry, but remain silent about the hands that made them. Its boats, carefully excavated and preserved, testify to maritime skill but leave unanswered questions about the voyages they undertook. Its name appears in foreign texts, a reminder of its reach, yet its voice is absent from its own written words. The Rajahnates of Butuan is both presence and absence, a kingdom remembered in gold and wood, in tribute missions and fragments, but never fully revealed. It invites us to imagine what lay along the banks of the Agusan, 1,000 years ago, ships preparing for journeys across seas, rulers adorned in gold, emissaries embarking on diplomatic missions that would carry the name of Butuan into imperial courts. But it also leaves us with a question. How many other kingdoms like Butuan once thrived in the archipelago, known only through fragments, their stories half told? If Butuan could rise, flourish, and fade, how many other polities lie hidden in the soil, waiting to emerge from silence? For now, the Rajahnates of Butuan stands as one of the Philippines' earliest windows into statehood and diplomacy, history, half mystery, its golden past shimmering just beyond our full understanding. The Rajahnates of Cebuan, the shores of the central Visayas, at the heart of the Philippine archipelago, a kingdom once thrived. It was called the Rajahnates of Cebu, maritime polity whose power lay not in towering palaces or stone monuments, but in its harbors, its trade networks, and its rulers who looked both to the seas and to the alliances they forged. Today, the Rajahnates survives in fragments of oral tradition, Spanish chronicles, and archaeological finds, a story half glimpsed yet central to the history of the islands. The tale of the Rajahnates of Cebu begins in the 10th and 11th centuries, in a world shaped by the rise of Southeast Asia's great trading states. From Srivijaya in Sumatra to Champa in Vietnam, the seas were alive with merchants, emissaries, and explorers. Cebu, lying at the crossroads of these routes, became a natural hub. Archaeologists have unearthed Chinese ceramics, Indian beads, and other foreign objects on the island, evidence that Cebu was part of these expansive exchanges long before Europeans arrived. But Cebu was not merely a port of call. By the 13th or 14th century, local rulers had consolidated power into what became known as the Rajahnates of Cebu. Its rulers bore the title of Raja, a term of Sanskrit origin that reflects the spread of Indianized political traditions across maritime Southeast Asia. The presence of this title suggests not only external influence, but also a deliberate assertion of authority, a way of placing Cebu within the larger network of regional powers. Oral traditions and later chronicles tell us that one of the most prominent rulers was Raja Srivijaya, said to be of mixed descent, with ties to both local Visayans and the broader networks of Southeast Asia. His lineage founded the ruling house of Cebu, and his descendants would continue to govern well into the age of Spanish contact. Under these rulers, Cebu's prosperity grew. It became both a trading hub and a political center, attracting merchants, migrants, and allies. The society of the Rajahnates was stratified, much like other Visayan polities. At its apex stood the ruling class, the Raja and his kin, supported by warriors and nobles. Beneath them were freemen who farmed, fished, and traded, and at the base were bondsmen who served their masters but could, through loyalty or marriage, rise in status. This social fabric ensured order while allowing for fluidity, a structure well suited to the maritime world, where shifting alliances could determine survival. Religion and ritual shaped daily life. The people of Cebu revered deities and ancestral spirits, conducting ceremonies led by shamans or babalon. These rituals sought protection for voyages, fertility for crops, and balance between the human and the unseen. Gold ornaments, beads, and carved objects found in the region hint at the symbolic richness of these practices, though later filtered through the writings of Spanish friars. The accounts suggest a world deeply alive with spiritual meaning. By the early 16th century, Cebu had become a significant player in regional politics. When Ferdinand Magellan arrived in 1521, he encountered a community already accustomed to foreign visitors. Raja Humabon, a descendant of Srivijaya, welcomed the Spaniards, engaging in exchanges of gifts and oaths. The alliance, however, was fragile. The baptism of Humabon and his subjects marked a dramatic moment of cultural contact, but it was followed by conflict and disillusion. Magellan's death at nearby Mactan, at the hands of Lapu-Lapu and his warriors, underscored the precarious balance of power in the Visayas. Still, the Spanish had glimpsed the importance of Cebu. When Miguel Lopez de Legazpi returned in 1565, Cebu became the site of the first Spanish settlement in the Philippines. The Rajahnates, weakened by internal divisions and external pressures, was absorbed into the colonial framework. Its rulers were transformed into local leaders under Spanish authority, and its independent identity as a Rajahnates came to an end. And yet, the memory of Cebu's pre-colonial kingdom persists. The Balangay boats, excavated in nearby regions, remind us of the maritime skill that underpinned Cebu's power. The presence of Indianized titles points to a wider cultural horizon, linking Cebu to the vast networks of Southeast Asia. The fragments of ceramics and ornaments unearthed in its soil speak of global connections long before European colonization. What remains elusive are the deeper structures of the Rajahnates itself. How centralized was its authority? Did its rulers control far-reaching territories, or were they more symbolic leaders of a maritime hub? Were its laws codified, or were they governed by customary tradition passed through oral memory? The absence of written records leaves these questions open, tantalizing but unanswered. The Rajahnates of Cebu is both history and mystery. History, because foreign documents and archaeological finds confirm its role as a center of trade and diplomacy. Mystery, because the voices of its own people, their laws, their myths, their everyday lives, survive only in fragments. Today, Cebu is a thriving metropolis, a hub of commerce, much as it was centuries ago. But beneath its modern skyline lies the memory of a kingdom that once commanded the seas, welcomed emissaries, and stood at the threshold of world history. The Rajahnates of Cebu reminds us that the Philippines was not a blank slate before colonization. It was a crossroads of cultures, a land of rulers and traders, of rituals and alliances. Its story is a reminder of how much lies beneath the surface of history, waiting, like the artifacts of Cebu itself, to be uncovered. And as we listen to the rhythms of the sea along its shores, we are left with one final question: how much of Cebu's ancient kingdom still lies buried, hidden beneath centuries of change, waiting to tell us more of its forgotten past? the Kidatuan of Dopitan on the northern shores of Mindanao, where the waves of the Bahol Sea crash against rugged coasts. There once stood a polity that thrived in the centuries before Spanish colonization. It is remembered as the Kidatuan of Dopitan, an ancient settlement tied to trade, migration, and the shifting politics of the Visayas and Mindanao. Today, its story is told only in fragments, half legend, half history, yet it remains a vital piece of the pre-colonial puzzle of the Philippines. The word Kidatuan itself reveals much, derived from Dotu, the Visayan and Mindanhoan title for chieftains or rulers. The term describes a polity governed by a network of leaders. In Southeast Asia, especially in the Malay world, the title was widespread, denoting small but organized principalities. The Kidatuan of Dopitan, then, was not a mere village, it was a recognized domain, led by powerful datas who commanded trade, warriors, and alliances. The origins of Dopitan's Kidatuan are wrapped in mystery. Oral traditions trace its roots to migrations from the Visayas, particularly from Bahol. Some stories recount that Dopitan was established by Visayan datas who sought new lands after conflict or displacement. Others suggest that it was both a refuge and a stronghold and outpost that linked the Visayas to Mindanao's northern coast. Strategically positioned along maritime trade routes, archaeological finds provide hints of its significance. Along the Dopitan coast, fragments of Chinese ceramics, beads, and trade goods have been discovered, suggesting that Dopitan, like Butuan and Cebu, participated in the regional networks of exchange. The Kidatuan likely traded forest products, pearls, and other local resources in exchange for ceramics, textiles, and metal goods arriving from China, India, and the wider Malay world. At its height, the Kidatuan of Dopitan was both a political and a cultural hub. Its rulers, like other Visayan datus, commanded loyalty from their subjects while maintaining alliances through marriage and warfare. Oral traditions describe the Kidatuan as a place of warriors, known for their skill in the sea raids, defined Visayan martial culture. Such raids were not merely acts of aggression, but also means of asserting prestige, securing resources, and building reputation across the islands. Yet Dopitan was not defined solely by conflict. It was also a place of refuge and diplomacy. Centuries later, in the Spanish period, Dopitan became a sanctuary for displaced Visayans. After the conquest of Cebu, its strategic position allowed it to serve both as a defensive stronghold against Moro raiders and as a contact point for Spanish missionaries and traders. But these later episodes only echo what must have been true in earlier centuries, that Dopitan's power rested on its location, its maritime connections, and its ability to adapt to shifting tides of influence. Religion and ritual likely played as central a role in Dopitan as in other Visayan societies. The people would have honored a pantheon of deities tied to sea, land, and ancestors, with Babylon priests and priestesses mediating between worlds. Though little direct evidence survives of Dopitan's spiritual life, its connection to the wider Visayan culture suggests that rituals of fertility, voyage, and warfare shaped its identity. By the 16th century, when Spanish expeditions began probing the coast of Mindanao, the Kidatuan of Dopitan was already facing the pressures of change. Regional politics were shifting. The rise of the Sultanate of Sulu and the expanding influence of Maguindanao redefined Mindanao's power balance. Dopitan, once an independent Kidatuan, became entangled in these larger struggles. Spanish records from the late 16th and early 17th centuries describe Dopitan as a key ally. Its Visayan population, hostile to the Moro raiders of Sulu, sided with Spanish forces. Jesuit missionaries later made Dopitan one of their centers, establishing churches and schools. Yet beneath these colonial layers lies the memory of a polity that predated foreign presence, a Kidatuan that had already forged its place in the maritime world. The mystery of the Kidatuan of Dopitan lies in its silence. Unlike Butuan, it left behind no gold masks or inscribed artifacts. Unlike Cebu, it was not immortalized in detailed Spanish accounts of first contact. What we know comes from oral traditions, scattered archaeological finds, and fragments of later colonial records. Was Dopitan a large-scale confederation of barangays, or a compact settlement ruled by a powerful lineage? Did it command influence across northern Mindanao, or was it primarily a Visayan outpost? The answers remain uncertain. And yet, the echoes of its past endure. The very name Dopitan recalls a place of gathering, of settlement. The people who lived there carried their traditions through the centuries, adapting them in times of war and colonization. Even in the 19th century, Butuan would again play host to a figure of resistance, José Rizal, exiled there by Spanish authorities. In this way, the Quetetuan's role as a place of refuge, resilience, and cultural memory continued across ages. The Quetetuan of Butuan may never be fully reconstructed. Its wooden houses and bamboo palisades have long vanished, its rituals silenced, its rulers remembered only in fragments of legend. But its importance lies precisely in this illusion. It reminds us that pre-colonial history was not only made of grand kingdoms and recorded treaties, but also of local polities, more yet significant. Nodes in the vast web of maritime Southeast Asia. As the waves still break upon the coast of Butuan, we are left to wonder, how many other Quetetuans once flourished along these shores, their stories washed away by time, waiting for the earthful memory to reveal them once more. The Kingdom of Tondo along the banks of the Pasig River, where it meets the waters of Maynila Bay, an ancient kingdom once rose to prominence. Long before Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, this polity controlled the heart of Luzon's trade. It was known as the Kingdom of Tondo, center of wealth, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, whose legacy remains one of the most intriguing chapters in Philippine history. The story of Tondo begins not with conquest, but with trade. Archaeological finds in the Maynila region reveal shards of Chinese porcelain, glass beads from India, and ornaments of gold that point to centuries of contact across Asia. As early as the 10th century, Chinese records mention a polity called Lusong, believed to be associated with central Luzon. By the 11th and 12th centuries, Tondo had already emerged as a significant power, controlling riverine and coastal routes that made it both accessible and defensible. At the heart of Tondo's influence was its location. The Pasig River served as both lifeline and boundary, linking the inland communities of Laguna de Bay with the vast waters of Maynila Bay. From here, traders could sail north toward China, west toward the South China Sea, or south into the Visayas and Mindanao. Tondo became not just a local kingdom, but a node in the wider maritime network of Southeast Asia. The rulers of Tondo bore the title Lakandula, Visayan, and Tagalog, honorific, meaning Lord of the Palace. This title, preserved in both oral tradition and Spanish chronicles, speaks of a political culture steeped in Indianized influences, where Sanskrit-derived terms such as Raja and Dotu blended with local authority structures. The Lakandula was not an absolute monarch in the modern sense, but a paramount leader whose power rested on kinship ties, tribute, and the ability to command loyalty in both trade and warfare. The social order of Tondo reflected a structured yet flexible hierarchy. At the top were the Maginu, the ruling nobility, from whom the Lakandula was chosen. Beneath them were the Maharlika, free warriors who owed military service, and the Timawa commoners engaged in farming, fishing, and trade. At the base of society were the Alapin bondsmen whose status could vary from household retainers to debt slaves, yet who were not entirely without rights. This layered society ensured both stability and mobility. A balance of tradition and pragmatism, religion and spirituality guided the rhythm of Tondo's people. They worshipped a pantheon of deities tied to nature and daily life, with rituals conducted by Catalonian shamans who mediated between the physical and the unseen world. Offerings, chants, and dances honored the spirits of land and water, seeking blessings for harvests, protection for voyages, and victory in war. Gold ornaments and ritual objects discovered in the Maynila region suggest a culture rich in symbolic meaning, where material wealth intertwined with spiritual expression. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Tondo had become a formidable regional power. Its wealth derived not only from controlling trade routes, but also from collecting tribute from surrounding barangays and allied settlements. Chinese records speak of Luzon traders arriving in Guangzhou, bringing forest products, pearls, and beeswax in exchange for silk and ceramics. Tondo's rulers maintained diplomatic ties with these foreign powers, securing their kingdom's prestige on the international stage. Yet Tondo's dominance was never uncontested. Across the Pasig River lay Maynila, a polity that would, in time, rise as both rival and partner. While Tondo looked inland and northward, Maynila oriented itself toward the sea and the wider Islamic world, adopting influences from Brunei and the Malay archipelago. By the late 15th century, The two polities existed side by side, Tondo with its Hindu-Buddhist and indigenous roots, and Maynila, increasingly shaped by Islam. It was in this landscape of shifting alliances that the Spanish first arrived. In 1571, Miguel López de Legazpi established Spanish Manila after the defeat of Raja Suleiman of Maynila and the eventual submission of Lacandula of Tondo. The conquest marked not only the fall of a kingdom, but the transformation of the Pasig Delta into a colonial capital. Yet even under Spanish rule, the descendants of Tondo's rulers retained prestige. Lacandula's lineage continued to wield influence as local leaders under the new regime. Their names preserved in history as intermediaries between the old and the new. What remains most mysterious about the Kingdom of Tondo is how little direct evidence of its institutions survives. Unlike the stone temples of Java or Angkor, Tondo's architecture was built from wood and bamboo, leaving few traces. Its laws were preserved only in oral memory, its myths transmitted across generations, but often altered in the retelling. Even the Laguna copperplate inscription, dated to 900 CE and discovered in nearby Laguna, offers only a tantalizing glimpse of a world where polities like Tondo already engaged in complex systems of debt, land rights, and political negotiation. The silence of Tondo's own voice forces us to rely on fragments, Chinese records, Spanish chronicles, oral traditions, and scattered archaeological finds. Did Tondo have a codified legal system like the ancient codes of India and Java, or were its rules entirely customary? How extensive was its authority beyond the Pasig Basin, its stretch into northern Luzon, or was it more confined to Manila Bay and its immediate hinterlands? These questions remain open, suspended in the space between history and legend. Today, Tondo survives as a name, one of Manila's most historic districts. Its crowded streets and bustling markets stand in stark contrast to the kingdom that once flourished there. Yet beneath the noise of modern life lies the memory of a polity that shaped the destiny of Luzon. Long before colonization, the Kingdom of Tondo challenges us to rethink the past. It was not an isolated village, but part of a sophisticated world of trade, politics, and culture that connected the Philippines to the greater currents of Asia. It reminds us that history is not only written in chronicles or etched in stone, but carried in memory, tradition, and the faint traces left behind by time. And so, as the Pasig River continues its eternal flow into Manila Bay, one can only wonder what other stories lie hidden beneath its waters, waiting to tell us more about the kingdom that once called its shores home. The May Kingdom on the western shores of the Philippine archipelago. Long before Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific, there flourished a trading polity remembered only in fragments of foreign chronicles. Its name was May. For centuries, it served as a crossroads of commerce between the islands and the wider world. Yet today, the Kingdom of May lingers more as a mystery than a memory, a forgotten chapter preserved only in the records of distant lands. The earliest descriptions of May appear not in local accounts, but in Chinese texts. In the year 971 CE, during the Song dynasty, Chinese envoys recorded the arrival of merchants from May, bringing with them trade goods to the bustling ports of southern China. To the Chinese, May was one of many barbarian kingdoms that dotted the seas of the south. But to the people of the archipelago, it was home, a flourishing center of exchange and diplomacy. Scholars continue to debate the exact location of May. Many believe it was centered on Mindoro, an island positioned strategically between Luzon and the Visayas, with access both to the South China Sea and inland trade routes. Others propose it may have referred to a broader federation of settlements along the western coasts of Luzon and nearby islands. What remains certain is that May occupied a place of importance in the maritime highways of Asia. Chinese accounts describe May as a land rich in natural resources. Traders from the kingdom carried forest products, beeswax, resins, tortoiseshell, and pearl items, highly prized in Chinese markets. In return, they acquired silk, ceramics, and iron goods, evidence of which has been unearthed in the archaeological record. Along the coasts of Mindoro and neighboring regions, shards of Song and Yuan dynasty porcelain have been found, tangible proof of May's role in long-distance exchange. The political structure of May remains elusive. The Chinese sources refer to its leader as a kingship or chieftaincy, but offer little detail on the internal organization of power. It is likely that May, like many early Southeast Asian polities, was akin to its authority, resting on alliances of barangays and the prestige of a ruling lineage. Tribute and loyalty would have bound smaller communities to the central polity, enabling it to sustain its influence and engage in diplomacy with foreign powers. Life in Mai, as far as we can reconstruct, must have revolved around both land and sea. Inland communities provided forest goods, rice, and other agricultural products, while coastal settlements facilitated exchange with visiting merchants. The Chinese describe Mai's people as honest traders, conducting business with a measure of fairness uncommon in other ports. This reputation may have contributed to the kingdom's prominence, making it a preferred destination for foreign ships navigating the South China Sea. Religion, too, would have played a significant role in Mai. Though direct evidence is scarce, it is probable that its people shared in the animistic and polytheistic traditions of the wider Visayan and Tagalog world. Babylon shamans would have presided over rituals, invoking spirits for guidance and protection. Yet hints of external influence may also have reached Mai, carried by traders from Champa, Srivijaya, and China. Beads, statues, and motifs suggest a subtle layering of Indianized and Buddhist elements, blending seamlessly with local belief systems. By the 13th century, Mai was firmly established in Chinese records as a recognized trading partner. From the kingdom are noted for offering tribute at imperial courts, further evidence of its prestige. It is even described as a place of order and relative peace, where foreign merchants could reside for months while awaiting the right winds to return home, for a polity remembered only in passing. Such descriptions speak volumes about its standing in the regional hierarchy. But like many ancient kingdoms, Mai's power was not to last. By the 14th century, its name begins to fade from Chinese records, replaced by new polities rising to prominence, Maynila, Tondo, and eventually the Islamic sultanates of Sulu and Maguindanao. What happened to Mai remains uncertain. Some scholars believe it was absorbed into larger neighboring states. Others suggest it may have declined due to shifting trade routes, internal conflict, or ecological pressures. Whatever the cause, Mai slipped quietly into obscurity. Unlike Butuan, it left behind no gold artifacts. Unlike Cebu or Maynila, it did not confront the Spanish directly. Its memory survived only in the writings of Chinese scribes, who saw it as one of many trading partners in the southern seas. Yet for the Philippines, Mai represents something more, evidence that the islands were not isolated, but active participants in the currents of Asian history long before colonization. Today, the name Mai endures faintly, preserved in historical studies and local lore. On the island of Mindoro, some towns still claim descent from this lost kingdom. The porcelain shards, the beads, the scattered traces in the soil, these are the whispers of its past. They remind us that Mai was once real, a thriving community whose influence reached far beyond its shores. The kingdom of Mai stands as both a beginning and an enigma. It is the first Philippine polity to be recorded in foreign chronicles, yet one of the least understood. It shows us the deep antiquity of trade, diplomacy, and culture in the archipelago, while reminding us of the fragility of memory, how entire kingdoms can vanish, leaving behind only the faintest echoes. And so we are left with a question: how many other Mais lie hidden in the shadows of history, kingdoms whose names were never recorded, whose traces remain buried beneath forests and fields, waiting for discovery? The Namayan kingdom along the southern banks of the Pasig River, where the waters flow gently from Laguna de Bay toward Manila Bay, there once thrived a forgotten kingdom. Its name was Namayan. Older than both Tondo and Maynila, Namayan has left behind only fragments of memory, yet these fragments hint at a polity of deep antiquity, whose legacy shaped the heart of what would one day become Manila. Namayan's origins are veiled in the mists of oral tradition. According to Tagalog genealogies, preserved by Spanish chroniclers, the kingdom was founded as early as the 6th century. If true, this would make it one of the earliest known organized settlements in the Philippine archipelago. Its seat of power was believed to be located in present-day Santa Ana, Manila district that today bustles with modern life, but once served as the center of an ancient riverine domain. At its height, Namayan extended its influence across a broad expanse of territory. Oral accounts describe its reach, stretching across what are now Mandaluyong, Makati, Pasay, and parts of Laguna. This suggests that Namayan was not a single village, but a network of settlements bound together by kinship and allegiance. Its people thrived along the fertile banks of the Pasig, where agriculture, fishing, and trade intertwined to sustain the community. The rulers of Namayan bore titles familiar across the archipelago: Datu or Raja. Spanish records speak of a ruler named Lakan Tagcon and his consort Butuan, whose lineage connected Namayan to later Tagalog dynasties. As in other polities of the time, power was both political and spiritual. The rulers stood not only as chief of warriors and distributor of wealth, but also as guardian of harmony between the people and the unseen world. Archaeology lends weight to Namayan's antiquity. Excavations in Santa Ana in the 20th century revealed pre-colonial artifacts, including pottery, beads, and Chinese ceramics, dating back as early as the 11th century. The most striking finds were burials beneath the grounds of the Santa Ana Church, containing grave goods that spoke of wealth, trade, and ritual practice. These discoveries confirmed what oral tradition had long suggested, that long before the Spanish built their churches along the Pasig, the site had been sacred ground for another people. Trade formed the lifeblood of Namayan. The Pasig River, a natural highway, connected its settlements to Laguna de Bay in the east and Maynila Bay in the west. From these waters, Namayan's traders could link to wider maritime networks stretching to China, Champa, and beyond. Porcelain wares from the Song and Yuan dynasties unearthed in the area reveal that foreign merchants once docked along these shores, exchanging silks and ceramics for local products such as rice, wax, pearls, and forest goods. The culture of Namayan was deeply intertwined with spirituality. Like other Tagalog polities, its people worshipped a pantheon of deities tied to nature, the spirits of rivers, trees, and mountains. Shamans, known as Catalonan, presided over ceremonies that honored these beings, offering food, chants, and ritual objects. The burial goods uncovered in Santa Ana suggest a belief in the afterlife, where wealth and offerings accompanied the dead into the next world. Though Namayan thrived for centuries, it eventually gave way to new powers. By the 15th century, the Kingdom of Tondo rose to prominence along the northern bank of the Pasig. Later, across the river, the Rajahnates of Maynila emerged under Muslim rulers influenced by Brunei. These new polities overshadowed Namayan, absorbing its territories and reshaping its identity. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Namayan was remembered only as an ancestral kingdom. Its rulers recalled through genealogy rather than contemporary power, yet the memory of Namayan lingered. Early Spanish friars, curious about the ancestry of local chiefs, recorded the names of its rulers and their descendants. Some accounts trace the bloodlines of prominent Tagalog leaders back to Namayan's founding figures, suggesting that its influence lived on through kinship and tradition even after its political decline. What makes Namayan especially mysterious is the silence of its own voice. Unlike the Laguna copperplate inscription, which provides a legal document from the same era, no written record from Namayan has ever been found. Its story survives only through oral tradition, Spanish chronicles, and the artifacts unearthed beneath Santa Ana's soil. This leaves many questions unanswered. How exactly was Namayan governed? Did it have laws and codes of conduct? Was it linked to other early polities such as May or Butuan? The answers remain elusive. Today, the name Namayan still lingers faintly in local memory. In Mandalore, one of its former territories, a barangay still carries the name. In Santa Ana, the artifacts uncovered beneath the church are preserved in museums, silent witnesses to a civilization long past. Modern life has risen atop its ruins, but beneath the streets and structures of Maynila lie the traces of an older city, a city whose foundations predate colonization by nearly a millennium. The Namayan kingdom invites us to reconsider the beginnings of Maynila. We often trace the city's history to 1571, when the Spanish established their colonial capital. But Namayan reminds us that the banks of the Pasig were already home to thriving communities, rulers, and networks of exchange centuries before European arrival. Maynila's story does not begin with colonization, it begins with kingdoms like Namayan, whose memory still whispers through the soil and water of the Pasig. And so, as we look across the riverbanks where Namayan once stood, one question lingers: how much of this ancient kingdom still lies buried, waiting to emerge from the ground, to remind us of the city that came before the city? The Maynila Kingdom, where the Pasig River meets the waters of Maynila Bay. A kingdom once rose strategically placed, culturally vibrant, and destined to shape the history of the Philippines. It was known as Maynila. For centuries, it stood as a gateway of trade and influence, a polity tied to both local traditions and the wider currents of Southeast Asia. And though its reign was short-lived in the face of European conquest, the echoes of the Maynila kingdom endure in the city that still bears its name. The origins of Maynila are entwined with both legend and geopolitics. Oral traditions speak of a settlement along the southern bank of the Pasig River, near what is now Intramuros, but the rise of Maynila as a kingdom is most often linked to the influence of the Sultanate of Brunei. In the 15th century, rulers from Brunei are said to have intervened in the region, establishing Muslim leaders to govern the area. This shift marked Maynila not merely as a local kingdom, but as part of a larger Islamic and maritime network stretching across Borneo, the Sulu Sea and beyond. The rulers of Maynila bore the title Raja, word of Indian origin, filtered through centuries of trade and cultural exchange in the region. Among the most well-known were Raja Matanda, Raja Sulaiman, and Raja Lak. Their reigns reflected the complex interplay of kinship, diplomacy, and trade. Lakandula himself traced lineage to the northern kingdom of Tondo, linking the two powers of the Pasig Delta by blood and alliance. At its height, Maynila controlled territories along the southern banks of the Pasig River and adjacent coastal areas, overseeing trade routes vital to the archipelago. Its people were Tagalog, sharing linguistic and cultural ties with surrounding polities. But through Islam, they were also connected to the wider world of the Malay sultanates, participating in a spiritual and political sphere that stretched far beyond Luzon. Trade formed the lifeblood of Maynila. The natural harbor of Manila Bay was among the finest in the region, able to host vessels from across Asia. Foreign merchants, particularly Chinese traders, arrived bearing porcelain, silks, and iron goods. In exchange, Maynila exported beeswax, pearls, gold, and forest products. Archaeological finds of Ming Dynasty ceramics and other imported goods confirm that this port city was firmly integrated into the commercial networks of the 15th and 16th centuries. Life in Maynila was marked by a blending of traditions. Indigenous animistic beliefs coexisted with the growing influence of Islam. Local chamans Catalonan continued to preside over rituals to ancestral spirits and nature deities, while Muslim preachers introduced Islamic teachings, law, and practices. The presence of mosques and Muslim communities in the area before Spanish conquest suggests that Maynila was a place of cultural intersection, where old and new faiths wove together into a shared identity. Yet Maynila was not without rivals. To the north lay the Kingdom of Tondo, an older polity whose rulers commanded loyalty from surrounding barriers. The relationship between Tondo and Maynila was complex, sometimes cooperative through kinship ties, other times competitive for influence along the Pasig. These twin powers created a dynamic political landscape at the river's mouth, a landscape that would prove both resilient and vulnerable. The arrival of the Spanish in the 16th century changed everything. When conquistadors led by Miguel López de Legazpi reached Manila in 1571, they encountered a thriving kingdom ruled jointly by Raja Matanda and his nephew, Raja Sulaiman. Both resisted Spanish encroachment. Accounts describe fierce battles along the Pasig as the people of Maynila fought to defend their homeland. But European weapons, alliances with rival groups, and sheer persistence tipped the balance. After successive confrontations, Maynila fell. The Spanish razed the settlement and built atop its ruins the fortified city of Intramuros. For them, Maynila became Maynila, the colonial capital of their empire in Asia. Yet the kingdom's rulers did not vanish overnight. Raja Sulaiman died in resistance, remembered as a symbol of defiance. Raja Matanda eventually allied with the newcomers, while Lakandwa, though tied to Tondo, negotiated terms that preserved some local autonomy. Their legacies lived on in the genealogies of Tagalog nobility and in the collective memory of the people. Though Maynila, as a kingdom, lasted scarcely a century in the written record, its significance lies in its position at the threshold of two worlds. It was a center of Tagalog power before colonization, a Muslim polity linked to Brunei and the wider Islamic world, and a hub of trade that connected the islands to China and beyond. Its fall marked not just the end of an indigenous kingdom, but the beginning of over 3 centuries of colonial rule. Today, the name Maynila remains modern Manila, a sprawling capital that grew from the foundations of that early kingdom. Beneath its streets, layers of history lie buried: ceramics from China, bones from ancient burials, traces of houses and palisades long gone. Each fragment whispers of the kingdom that once commanded the bay. The Maynila kingdom stands as a reminder of a past often overshadowed by colonization. It tells us that before the Spanish conquest, there were rulers and dynasties, trade networks and faiths, kingdoms that thrived on their own terms. And it leaves us with a question that lingers like the tide along the Pasig. What other forgotten kingdoms once stood upon these islands, their stories still hidden beneath the soil and the waters of time? The Ibalan kingdom in the shadow of Mount Asog and the slopes of the Bicol Peninsula. There lies a story preserved not in ruins or artifacts, but in epic poetry. It is the tale of Ibalan, a kingdom remembered through legend, song, and the whispers of history. Unlike Tondo, Maynila, or Butuan, Ibalan's story is not bound to a single archaeological site. Instead, it lives in the lines of the Ibalong epic, a narrative that blurs the line between myth and memory, and within it, we catch a glimpse of a kingdom that may have once stood in the ancient heart of Bicol. The Ibalong epic is one of the rare fragments of pre-colonial oral literature to survive into modern times, transcribed by Spanish missionaries in the 19th century. It speaks of heroes who arrived by boat, battling beasts and taming the land. Among them was Boltag, who fought monstrous creatures threatening the people; Handiong, who introduced laws and technologies; and Bantong, who vanquished the terrifying half-man, half-beast called Rabat. The epic weaves a world where the wild is subdued by human courage, where society is built upon the foundations of struggle and resilience. Yet within this tapestry of myth, historians see faint outlines of history. The kingdom of Ibalan, as described in the epic, appears to have been a thriving settlement somewhere in the Bicol region, possibly near present-day Camarines, Sur, or Albay. Its people were called Ibalonans, and their land was fertile, rich with rivers, forests, and coasts. The battles with monsters may have symbolized the challenges of early settlers: floods, volcanic eruptions, wild animals, and hostile tribes. The heroes' victories, in turn, reflected the gradual establishment of order, agriculture, and governance. The geography of the Bicol Peninsula reinforces these connections. Volcanic landscapes, frequent typhoons, and shifting rivers shaped the lives of its inhabitants. The fiery presence of Mayon volcano, always looming, may have given rise to tales of great upheavals, translated into myth as battles with giants and beasts. To live in Ibalan was to live in constant negotiation with nature, a theme that resounds in the epic's verses. Like other early polities, Ibalan would have relied on agriculture and trade. Rice paddies carved into valleys, root crops grown in the highlands, and abundant fisheries along the coasts sustained its people. The Bicol region's location placed it along maritime routes, stretching toward the Visayas and even to Luzon, allowing exchange with neighboring groups. Archaeological finds in Bicoling, including shards of pottery and traces of settlements, suggest a long history of habitation and external contact. The figure of Handiong in the epic is especially revealing. Beyond his feats of heroism, he is credited with bringing laws, introducing weaving and pottery, and building fortified towns. Such details hint at the memory of a leader, or perhaps a succession of leaders who organized Ibalan into a more structured society. These references may reflect the gradual evolution of the region from scattered communities into a centralized polity recognizable as a kingdom. But much of Ibalan's story remains intangible. Unlike Tondo or Butuan, no royal genealogies or detailed Spanish records preserve its rulers' names. Instead, we are left with a poetic fragment, the Ibalong epic, which is as much legend as history. Did Boltag and Handiong truly exist as historical figures, or were they mythic archetypes created to embody the struggles of early settlers? Was Ibalan a unified kingdom, or a loose confederation of villages bound together by shared memory? These questions linger unanswered. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they encountered communities in the Bicol region, but did not record any kingdom named Ibalan. For them, the peninsula was a frontier, distant from the centers of power in Maynila and Cebu. Yet the persistence of the epic, passed down through generations, suggests that the people of Bicol remembered a time when their land had been united under heroes and leaders whose stories blurred into myth. Today, Ibalan remains an enduring cultural symbol in Bicol, The epic is celebrated in festivals, taught in schools, and retold as part of the region's heritage. For the people of Bicol, it is both a story of origins and a declaration of reminder that their ancestors faced challenges as formidable as monsters and triumphed. But for historians and archaeologists, Ibalan poses a tantalizing mystery. How much of the epic reflects historical memory, and how much is legend? Kuf's excavations yet uncover settlements that match the descriptions in the tale. Or was Ibalan never a singular kingdom at all, but a cultural idea, an imagined homeland woven into the narrative identity of the Bicolanos? The Ibalan kingdom stands apart from other pre-colonial polities in the Philippines. It does not leave behind stone walls, copper plates, or royal titles etched into foreign chronicles. Instead, it lives in poetry, in the battles of heroes, in the shaping of a land from chaos into order, in the myths that carried history where memory could not. And so, as we listen to the echoes of the Ibalong epic, we are left with a haunting reflection. Perhaps Ibalon was not a kingdom of stone and earth, but a kingdom of memory, preserved in the only way it could survive, through story. And within those stories may still lie fragments of a past waiting to be rediscovered, hidden in the soil, the mountains, and the voices of a people who refuse to forget. The Srivijaya, trading ports at the crossroads of the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, where ships carried spices, silks, and porcelain across the waves. A great thalassocracy once ruled. Its name was Srivijaya. For over 6 centuries, this maritime empire dominated the seas of Southeast Asia. But it was not vast armies or sprawling cities that gave Srivijaya its power. It was its ports, gateways of wealth and culture that connected worlds. Today, their remnants lie scattered across Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, and beyond, silent witnesses to a kingdom built upon the sea. The rise of Srivijaya is traced to the 7th century. Centered in Palembang on the island of Sumatra, it emerged in a region of tidal rivers, mangrove estuaries, and fertile floodplains. Here, geography shaped destiny. The Musi River linked Palembang to the sea, while the Straits of Malacca offered a natural choke point for maritime trade. By establishing control over this crucial passage, Srivijaya could oversee taxis and protect the ships that moved between India and China. But Srivijaya was not a single city alone. Its strength lay in a network of ports, nodes of commerce, diplomacy, and culture. Archaeological evidence points to trading hubs at Palembang, Jambi, Chaya in southern Thailand, and Kedah in the Malay Peninsula. These ports acted as intrepids, where foreign merchants could dock, exchange goods, and replenish supplies before continuing their journeys. The Chinese records of the Tang and Song dynasties describe these ports as vibrant centers of exchange. Porcelain, silk, and coins flowed in from China. Spices, resins, camphor, and precious woods came from the Indonesian archipelago, while Indian traders brought beads, cloth, and religious texts. Srivijaya's ports became melting pots where goods were bartered, ideas were exchanged, and cultures intertwined. Palembang, the heart of the empire, stood as the greatest of these ports. Inscriptions carved into stone, such as the Kedikun Bukit inscription of 683 CE, revealed rulers claiming divine sanction and maritime conquests. Palembang's riverine landscape was dotted with wooden houses on stilts, boats tied along the banks, and markets alive with traders speaking many tongues. Though no grand stone palaces remain, the city's importance lay not in monumental architecture but in its command of waterways. Further north, Kedah served as a critical stopover for ships crossing the Bay of Bengal. Archaeological excavations there uncovered Indian beads, Persian ceramics, and Buddhist statues, evidence of its role as both a commercial and cultural hub. Chaya, in present-day Thailand, meanwhile, has yielded remains of Buddhist temples and inscriptions linking it to Srivijaya's spiritual life. These ports were not isolated, they formed an interconnected system that bound the region into a cohesive maritime sphere. Religion flourished alongside commerce. Srivijaya was a major center of Mahayana Buddhism, attracting pilgrims and scholars from across Asia. The Chinese monk Ye Jing, who visited in the 7th century, described Palembang as a great center of Buddhist learning where monks could study Sanskrit and doctrine before continuing to Nalanda in India. Srivijaya's rulers patronized monasteries, built temples, and welcomed foreign pilgrims, weaving religion into the empire's prestige. The ports of Srivijaya also embodied the empire's political strategy. Rather than conquering vast territories inland, Srivijaya forged alliances and exerted influence over coastal settlements. Local chiefs could benefit from trade under Srivijaya's protection, while the empire collected tribute and controlled sea lanes. This flexible, maritime approach allowed Srivijaya to thrive for centuries, adjusting to the changing currents of commerce. Yet the story of these ports is also a story of fragility. By the 11th century, Srivijaya faced challenges from rival powers. The Chola dynasty of South India launched raids against its ports, plundering Kedah and even attacking Palembang. Although Srivijaya recovered, its dominance was weakened. Over time, new maritime centers such as Melaka rose to prominence, eclipsing the old network of Srivijayan ports. Today, the remains of these once bustling hubs are faint. In Palembang, traces of ancient canals and brick foundations lie beneath the modern city. At Kedah, archaeologists uncover artifacts from India and the Middle East, silent reminders of its cosmopolitan past. In Chaya, weathered stupas stand as monuments to a time when Buddhist monks and merchants gathered at the edge of the sea. The ocean has reclaimed much, but fragments endure, enough to suggest the vast scope of Srivijaya's influence. The Srivijaya trading ports remind us of a world where the sea was not a barrier but a highway, carrying goods and ideas across continents. They reveal how a kingdom without vast armies or great walls could dominate Asia for centuries by mastering the flows of commerce and faith. And yet, their mystery lingers. Was Srivijaya truly a centralized empire, or a loose confederation of coastal cities bound by trade? How many of its ports remain undiscovered, hidden beneath mangroves, rivers, or the modern sprawl of Southeast Asian towns? The tides that once carried its ships now conceal its ruins. Srivijaya's trading ports leave us with a question that resists final answers. Was the empire's true legacy its political power, or was it the invisible web of connections it forged? Across the seas, perhaps its greatest monument was not built of stone, but of currents, winds, and the timeless rhythm of trade. *The Pohnpeian Sordala dynasty in the remote expanse of Micronesia. On the island of Pohnpei lies a site unlike any other in the Pacific. Its name is Nan Madol, city built upon a lattice of canals and artificial islets, constructed from massive basalt stones that seem impossible to have been moved without modern machinery. Rising from the waters of a shallow lagoon, it has often been called the Venice of the Pacific. But behind this monumental city lies the story of a dynasty, the Sordala, whose reign shaped Pohnpei for centuries, and whose legacy is wrapped in equal parts history and legend. The Sordala dynasty is said to have begun around the late 12th or early 13th century, when two foreign brothers, Alosapa and Alasaha, arrived on Pohnpei by canoe. Oral traditions describe them as sorcerers, gifted with knowledge and power beyond that of the islanders. They established themselves as rulers, and from their line came the Sordala, the first centralized political authority in Pohnpei. What had once been scattered chiefdoms became unified under one dynasty, bringing order, but also tension. Nan Madol became the center of their rule. Stretching across more than 90 islets, the complex was constructed with basalt logs, columnar stones, stacked in interlocking patterns, some weighing several tons. These islets were connected by canals and seawalls, forming a city on the water. The scale of the construction is staggering, especially given that Pohnpei lacked draft animals, metal tools, or wheels. To this day, how the basalt stones were quarried, transported, and assembled remains one of the Pacific's enduring mysteries. Within Nan Madol, the Sordala built palaces, temples, and tombs. The islet of Nan Dawes, with its high basalt walls enclosing royal tombs, stands as a testament to the dynasty's grandeur. Religious structures dedicated to sea deities and ancestral spirits reinforced the divine authority of the rulers. In this watery city, the Sordala ruled over their subjects with a power that combined political control and sacred ritual. Under the dynasty, Pohnpei was transformed. The Sordala imposed tribute systems, requiring surrounding clans to deliver food, mats, and resources to Nan Madol. Breadfruit, taro, yams, and fish sustained the city's population, while outer communities shouldered the burden of supply. This system centralized wealth and reinforced the dynasty's dominance. Yet oral traditions also recall that the Sordala grew increasingly oppressive. Their demands became harsh, their rule heavy-handed, and resentment spread among the islanders. Legends speak of strict regulations, even in matters of food and belief. Some accounts say that commoners were forbidden to eat certain delicacies, or that they were forced to comply with rituals that disregarded Pohnpeian traditions. Over time, the once respected dynasty came to be seen as foreign and alien, its rulers detached from the people they governed. The fall of the Sordler is preserved in Pohnpeian legend. According to oral tradition, a warrior named Isokelekal arrived from Kosrae, another island in Micronesia. Invited by discontented Pohnpeians, Isokelekal led a revolt against the Sordler. After fierce battles, the dynasty was overthrown, and Nan Madol was abandoned as the seat of power. In its place arose a new political order known as the non-Morki system, a decentralized chieftaincy that continues in Pohnpei today. Archaeology provides glimpses into this transformation, but much remains uncertain. Radiocarbon dating suggests that Nan Madol reached its peak during the Sordler era, though construction may have begun earlier. Excavations have uncovered artifacts such as shell tools, fishhooks, and pottery, but the city's purpose and population remain debated. Was Nan Madol truly home to thousands, or was it primarily a ceremonial and political center? Did the Sordler control a vast island-wide empire, or was their authority more symbolic than absolute? What is clear is that Nan Madol stands as one of the greatest architectural achievements of the Pacific Islands. Its engineering challenges remain unsolved. Without pulleys, wheels, or beasts of burden, how did the islanders move basalt columns weighing up to 50 tons? Some suggest that the stones were floated on rafts or rolled on logs, but Pohnpei's steep terrain and dense jungles make such feats almost unimaginable. For this reason, Nan Madol has inspired centuries of speculation, ranging from local legends of magical levitation to modern theories of lost technologies. The story of the Sordler dynasty, then, occupies a space between history and myth. On one hand, it represents the rise of centralized authority in Pohnpei, the building of monumental architecture, and the shaping of a political system that influenced the island long after the dynasty's fall. On the other hand, it is remembered through oral traditions filled with supernatural elements or Srivijayas, divine rulers, and warriors with extraordinary powers. Today, Nan Madol is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized as a cultural treasure and a marvel of human ingenuity. Its basalt walls still stand in quiet dignity, surrounded by mangroves and tidal waters. Visitors who arrive often describe a sense of awe and silence, as if the stones themselves still carry the weight of history. The Sordler dynasty is long gone, but its city endures, half claimed by the sea and the forest. And yet, the mystery lingers. Was Nan Madol truly the heart of a thriving metropolis, or was it a ceremonial complex built to project power? Were the Sordler remembered as tyrants because they were outsiders, or because their rule genuinely became oppressive? And perhaps, most tantalizing of all, how did the builders of Pohnpei move stones so massive across such difficult terrain? The answers remain elusive, hidden in oral traditions, scattered artifacts, and the silent walls of Nan Madol. But the story of the Sordler dynasty reminds us that even in the smallest islands of the Pacific, human ambition could shape landscapes on a monumental scale. And as the tide rises and falls around Nan Madol's basalt ruins, it leaves us with a question that history has not yet resolved. Were the Sordler rulers merely men, or did they carry with them the echo of something greater, something that the islanders, centuries later, still remember as both history and legend? The Nan Madol Civilization, in the western Pacific Ocean, far from the centers of ancient empires, lies an island cloaked in rainforest and encircled by reefs. On its eastern shore, in the shallow waters of a lagoon, stands one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites on Earth. Its name is Nan Madol City, built upon the sea, constructed from basalt stones so massive that even today their movement seems to defy explanation. For centuries, this watery city was the ceremonial and political heart of a civilization unlike any other in Micronesia. Nan Madol was more than just a city. It was a symbol of power, belief, and ambition. Rising from the tidal flats of Pohnpei Island, it consists of nearly 100 artificial islets connected by canals, seawalls, and narrow passages. From above, it resembles a grid of stone and water, an engineered landscape where ritual and rule converged. Built between the 12th and 13th centuries, it became the seat of the Sordler dynasty. the first centralized political authority in Pohnpei, but the origins of Nan Madol stretch deeper into a mixture of archaeology and oral tradition, where fact and legend intertwine. The construction of Nan Madol remains one of its greatest mysteries. The site's builders quarried massive columnar basalt from distant cliffs, transporting and stacking the stones in interlocking patterns that form walls up to 9 meters high. Some individual stones weigh as much as 50 tons. Without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools, how were they moved across the island's rugged terrain and into place upon the lagoon? Local traditions speak of magic of stones flown through the air by sorcery. Modern archaeologists suggest wooden sledges, rollers, or rafts. Yet the logistics of moving such vast weights across forests, rivers, and reefs remain a puzzle. Within the city, the islets served distinct purposes. Some were residential, housing priests, nobles, and attendants of the Sordala rulers. Others were reserved for rituals, with temples dedicated to sea gods and ancestral spirits. The most imposing of all was Nan Dawas, an islet ringed with massive basalt walls enclosing the tombs of rulers. Its fortress-like design gave it an air of sacred power, reinforcing the divine authority of the Sordala dynasty. The society that built Nan Madol was organized around tribute and control. Surrounding communities across Pohnpei were required to supply food, mats, and labor to sustain the rulers who lived within the stone city. Breadfruit, taro, fish, and coconuts flowed into Nan Madol, supporting its elite class. In return, the dynasty imposed laws and rituals that reached into daily life. Oral histories recall strict regulations, prohibitions on what could be eaten, when rituals must be performed, and how tribute must be delivered. Yet beneath the order, resentment, group stories described the Sordala as foreign rulers, descended from outsiders who arrived by canoe and used supernatural power to establish control. At first, they were respected, but as generations passed, their rule became increasingly oppressive. Islanders spoke of heavy demands and a disregard for traditional customs. What had once seemed divine began to feel burdensome, and discontent spread through the island. The fall of Nan Madol is preserved in legend. According to oral tradition, a warrior named Isakelikal sailed from the island of Kosrae to challenge the Sordala. Welcomed by locals weary of tyranny, he led a rebellion that toppled the dynasty. Nan Madol, once the seat of power, was abandoned as the ruling center. In its place arose the non-Walkie system, a decentralized chieftaincy that still shapes Pohnpei's politics today. Archaeology adds layers to this story, but does not erase its mysteries. Excavations have revealed pottery, shell tools, and fish remains, but the scale of permanent habitation within Nan Madol is uncertain. Some scholars believe it housed thousands, a thriving urban center supported by constant tribute. Others argue it may have been primarily ceremonial, a sacred city, where rulers displayed their authority through spectacle and ritual. Whatever the case, Nan Madol was the heart of a civilization whose power radiated across Pohnpei for centuries. Its uniqueness cannot be overstated. Across the Pacific, monumental architecture often took the form of earthworks, stone terraces, or Maori, but nowhere else was a city built entirely on artificial islets over water on such a massive scale. Nan Madol is both a feat of engineering and a statement of ideology. The rulers of Pohnpei did not simply command land, they remade the landscape itself. Today, Nan Madol lies partly reclaimed by nature. Mangroves wind through its canals, tidal waters lap against basalt walls, and birds nest where priests once conducted rituals. Recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it stands as a monument to human ingenuity and as a mystery still unresolved. For while archaeologists can measure stones, date organic remains, and map canals, many questions endure. How exactly were the stones transported? Why was such a monumental city built upon the sea, instead of inland where resources were more abundant? And why, after centuries of power, did the site fall silent so abruptly? For the people of Pohnpei, Nan Madol is not merely ruins, it is a place where history, culture, and spirituality converge. Oral traditions keep alive the memory of the Sordala and their successors, blending fact with myth in a way that resists separation. To outsiders, Nan Madol is a marvel of lost engineering. To islanders, it is a living part of identity, a reminder of both the grandeur and the lessons of the past. And so, the Nan Madol civilization remains suspended between two worlds, the tangible world of stone ruins and the intangible world of memory and legend. Its canals, now silent, once echoed with the sounds of ritual chants, paddles striking water, and the labor of thousands. Its walls, now weathered, once proclaimed the might of rulers who sought to embody divine authority. But what is most enduring is not simply the basalt city, nor the dynasty that built it, but the mystery that still surrounds it. Were the visionary leaders or oppressive tyrants? Was Nan Madol a metropolis of thousands, or a ceremonial stage designed to awe and control? And above all, how did an island society, with only the simplest of tools, create one of the most enigmatic cities in the Pacific? The answers remain hidden beneath the waters, in the mangrove roots, and in the stories passed from generation to generation. And perhaps that is fitting. For Nan Madol was never just a city. It was a vision brought to life, a civilization carved from stone and sea, and a mystery that the tides of history have never fully revealed. The Lapita culture across the blue expanse of the Pacific, scattered islands rise from the sea like stepping stones. It was across these waters that one of humanity's greatest voyages unfolded, an odyssey that carried people farther into the unknown ocean than ever before. These were the Lapita, a seafaring culture whose legacy can still be traced in the languages, traditions, and very faces of today's Pacific Islanders. The Lapita culture flourished between 1600 and 500 BCE, stretching from the coasts of islands Southeast Asia to the far reaches of Polynesia. They are remembered not through grand monuments of stone, but through fragments of clay distinctive pottery adorned with intricate dentate-stamped designs. Found across a vast region, these shards reveal the trail of a people who expanded farther and faster than almost any other in ancient history. Archaeologists first recognized the Lapita through these ceramics, discovered in the 20th century at a site in New Caledonia. The name Lapita itself comes from Zapata, a word from a local language meaning to dig a hole. Since then, pottery with the same characteristic motifs, geometric patterns, repeating chevrons, and stylized human faces has been unearthed from Papua New Guinea to Samoa, tracing a cultural horizon that spans more than 4,000 kilometers of ocean. But pottery is only the beginning of their story. The Lapita were master navigators and sailors, voyaging in double-hulled canoes across open seas without compasses, maps, or metal tools. Guided by the stars, the movement of waves, and the flight of birds, they carried with them not only people, but entire ecosystems. Chickens, pigs, dogs, and domesticated plants, such as taro and yam, traveled aboard their vessels, ensuring that wherever they landed, life could take root. This expansion was not random. Archaeological evidence shows a deliberate sequence of settlement. First the islands of the Bismarck archipelago, then Vanuatu, New Caledonia, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. These would become the foundations of what later blossomed into the great Polynesian societies, the Tongans, Samoans, and eventually the Hawaiians, Maori, and Rapa Nui. The Lapita were the ancestors of Oceania's great voyagers, the people who transformed the Pacific into a highway of exploration. Their settlements, often established along coasts and lagoons, were typically composed of stilt houses built over shallow water. This placement offered both protection and access to marine resources. From these bases, they fished with hooks made from shell and bone, harvested shellfish, and farmed small plots of taro and yam. The combination of farming and fishing sustained their communities as they adapted to each new island environment. But it is their pottery that most clearly reveals their cultural identity. The decorative motifs are so precise and repetitive that they suggest a shared symbolic system, perhaps even a form of communication or storytelling. Some vessels bear human-like faces, with eyes, noses, and mouths rendered in abstract forms. Others display endless rows of geometric designs, carefully pressed with toothed stamps into wet clay before firing. The wide distribution of this style indicates not only a shared heritage, but also active networks of exchange. Indeed, the Lapita were traders as much as voyagers. Archaeological finds show that they exchanged obsidian, shell ornaments, and other goods across hundreds of miles. This suggests a complex web of interaction, linking far-flung islands into a cultural network. Such networks required not just seafaring skill, but social cohesion, trust and kinship ties, and shared traditions that bound communities together, despite the vast distances of ocean separating them. And yet, the Lapita culture remains enigmatic. Around 500 BCE, their distinctive pottery style gradually disappeared. The reasons remain uncertain. Some scholars suggest that as communities spread further east, pottery became less practical in environments with limited clay resources. Others argue that cultural changes simply led to the abandonment of elaborate decoration in favor of plainer, utilitarian vessels. Whatever the cause, the disappearance of Lapita ceramics marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, the rise of the Polynesian societies that would carry their seafaring legacy even farther. But the question lingers: who were the Lapita, and where did they come from? Linguistic evidence suggests they were speakers of Austronesian languages, originally from Taiwan and the northern Philippines. From there, their ancestors moved southward through island Southeast Asia before reaching the Bismarck archipelago. Around 1600 BCE, genetic studies support this, showing a blending of Asian and Papuan ancestry in Lapita remains. In essence, the Lapita culture was the meeting point of two worlds: maritime farmers from the north and indigenous peoples of Melanesia who together forged a new identity suited to the Pacific. Their impact cannot be overstated. The Lapita were the pioneers of the Pacific, laying the foundations for the cultures that followed. Without their voyages, Polynesia, Micronesia, and much of Melanesia would have remained unpeopled for centuries longer. Every Polynesian canoe that sailed to Hawaii, to New Zealand, to Easter Island, each carried with it the legacy of the Lapita navigators who first dared to push beyond the horizon. Today, the story of the Lapita culture is pieced together from shards of pottery, genetic markers, and the oral traditions of Pacific Islanders, but gaps remain. We can map their journeys, reconstruct their houses, and analyze their diets, but the deeper meanings of their designs, the spiritual significance of their voyages, and the voices of the Lapita people themselves remain silent. Standing on the shores of the Pacific today, one can look across the endless sea and imagine what it must have been like for them, the horizon unbroken, the stars wheeling overhead, the creak of wooden canoes carrying families and futures into the unknown. It was a gamble few cultures ever attempted, yet the Lapita succeeded, transforming the Pacific from a barrier into a bridge. And still, the mystery endures. Why did they leave their homelands to venture into such vast distances? What stories were etched into the patterns of their pottery, now broken and scattered across the ocean's edge? And how, with nothing but the knowledge of wind, stars, and wave, did they achieve one of the greatest feats of exploration in human history? The Lapita culture may be known to us only in fragments, but their legacy lives on in every Pacific Island community. Their voyages remind us of both the fragility and the resilience of human endeavor, and of the mysteries that remain when history is written, not in books or stone, but in the sea itself. The Rapa Nui Civilization, in the heart of the Pacific Ocean, over 3,500 kilometers from the nearest continent, lies one of the most isolated inhabited islands on Earth. Its landscape is windswept and volcanic, with rolling grasslands punctuated by towering stone figures. This is Rapa Nui, known to the outside world as Easter Island, and it is here that one of history's most mysterious civilizations rose, flourished, and declined, leaving behind silent giants as their testament. The story of the Rapa Nui Civilization is a story of ambition, ingenuity, and resilience, but also one of fragility in the face of isolation. Between 800 and 1200 CE, Polynesian voyagers arrived on this small island, having navigated thousands of kilometers of open ocean in double canoes. Guided by the stars, the winds, and the swells, they reached this remote land and made it their home. In doing so, they founded one of the most remarkable societies in the Pacific world. At first glance, Rapa Nui seems barren. It lacks the broad resources of larger islands such as Hawaii or New Zealand. Yet the early settlers adapted. They cultivated sweet potatoes, taro, bananas, and sugarcane. They raised chickens and fished from the surrounding waters. They built stone gardens, sheltered from the wind, to nurture crops in the thin volcanic soil. Through ingenuity, they carved out a livelihood in one of the most remote places on Earth. But it was not agriculture alone that defined their culture. It was the moai, the great stone statues for which Rapa Nui is famed. Rising as high as 10 meters, weighing as much as 80 tons. These colossal figures were carved from volcanic tuff in the quarry of Rano Raku. Once completed, they were transported across the island, often for kilometers, two stone platforms known as ahu. There, they stood facing inland, watching over the communities they represented. The moai were not mere monuments. They embodied monospiritual power and served as ancestral guardians. Each statue represented a lineage, its size reflecting both prestige and reverence. To erect a moai was to honor one's ancestors and to demonstrate status in the highly competitive society of Rapa Nui. Rival clans vied with one another, constructing ever larger and more imposing statues, until the island itself became a living gallery of stone figures gazing toward the villagers. The construction of the moai demanded not only skill but organization. Carving, transporting, and raising these statues required coordinated labor, engineering knowledge, and a deep spiritual commitment. Oral traditions speak of the statues walking to their destinations, a phrase that has sparked debate for centuries. Some archaeologists suggest that ropes and coordinated rocking motions could indeed have allowed the statues to be walked upright across the landscape. Others propose sledges, rollers, or wooden tracks. However they moved, the effort reflects the extraordinary determination of the Rapa Nui people. Yet beneath this achievement lay a challenge. The island's environment was fragile. Early forests, once filled with giant palms, were cut down over generations, used for canoes, fuel, and possibly the movement of statues. As trees disappeared, so too did soil fertility and the ability to build large ocean-going vessels. By the 16th century, ecological stress was mounting. Erosion worsened, crops declined, and conflicts grew. Oral traditions recalled battles between clans, and evidence shows that some statues were toppled in acts of defiance. For many years, scholars framed Rapa Nui as a story of ecological collapse, a cautionary tale of overexploitation leading to societal ruin. The island, it was said, destroyed itself before European contact, but more recent studies challenged this view. Archaeologists argue that the Rapa Nui adapted in ingenious ways. They built rock gardens to preserve soil moisture, constructed stone mulching systems, and continued to sustain their society for centuries. Their decline, they suggest, was not inevitable. Instead, it was accelerated by outside forces. In 1722, Dutch explorers arrived on Easter Sunday, giving the island its European name. Later, expeditions brought new pressures, disease, slave raids, and cultural disruption. By the 19th century, Rapa Nui's population had been devastated, its people forced into labor, its traditions suppressed. The once thriving civilization of thousands was reduced to just over 100 survivors by 1877. The collapse, it seems, was not merely ecological, it was colonial. And yet, the people endured. Despite centuries of hardship, the descendants of the Rapa Nui still live on the island today, preserving their language, their traditions, and their connection to the moai. The statues themselves remain powerful symbols, not of loss, but of resilience. Standing silently, they remind us of the ingenuity and determination of a people who thrived in one of the most isolated places on Earth. Still, questions remain. Why did the Rapa Nui devote such immense energy to their statues? How exactly did they move them across the island's rugged terrain? Were the toppled moai signs of civil war, or part of ritual transformation? And what was the full story of their encounter with Europeans, a meeting that reshaped their destiny forever? Nan Madol was called the Venice of the Pacific. The Lapita are remembered as voyagers of the unknown. The Rapa Nui, in turn, are remembered for their giants of stone statues that hold their secrets close. Their civilization, balanced between triumph and fragility, continues to provoke debate, fascination, and awe. As the waves crash upon the rocky shores of Rapa Nui, the moai still stand, their faces weathered, their eyes empty, their presence commanding. They are witnesses to both the greatness and the struggles of the people who raised them, and perhaps, in their silence, they still guard the mysteries of a civilization that dared to thrive on the world's most remote frontier. The Marquesan culture, far out in the central Pacific, where volcanic peaks rise steeply from the sea, lies an island group both beautiful and formidable. The Marquesas is remote, rugged, and deeply carved by valleys and cliffs. These islands became the homeland of a people whose culture was among the most distinctive in Polynesia. The Marquesan civilization, flourishing for centuries before European contact, left behind a legacy of artistry, warfare, and ritual that continues to intrigue scholars today. The Marquesas were settled by Polynesian voyagers around 200 CE. These seafarers, descendants of the Lapita culture, carried with them plants, animals, and knowledge of navigation that allowed them to thrive in this challenging environment. Unlike the more fertile islands of Hawaii or Tahiti, the Marquesas were difficult to cultivate. The steep terrain and limited coral reefs demanded ingenuity. The Marquesans adapted, constructing terraced gardens along valley floors, raising and taro, and supplementing their diets with fishing and foraging. But the rugged geography shaped more than their subsistence, it molded their society. Each valley became the domain of a chief, and rivalries often grew intense. Warfare was frequent, and control of land and prestige was constantly contested. Oral traditions recall battles fought across ridges and rivers, while archaeological remains of fortified hilltops attest to the reality of conflict. Amid this competition, art and ritual flourished. The Marquesans are perhaps best remembered for their body art tattooing, so elaborate and extensive that individuals could be covered from head to toe. Tattoos were not merely decoration, they marked status, identity, and spiritual power. Each design carried meaning, and to be fully tattooed was a mark of prestige, endurance, and belonging. For centuries, the Marquesas were renowned across Polynesia as a center of tattooing, and the very word tatatha, root of the English tattoo, was carried from this tradition. Stone carving also reached remarkable levels of sophistication. The Marquesans created tiki figures, anthropomorphic statues of deities or ancestors carved from basalt or wood. These figures, with their large heads, pronounced eyes, and squat bodies, reflected the spiritual connection between humans and the divine. They were often placed in sacred spaces, called matche, where rituals and ceremonies took place. These rituals were central to Marquesan life. Society was stratified, with chiefs and priests holding spiritual authority. Feasts and ceremonies reinforced the social order, while offerings were made to gods and ancestors. Human sacrifice, while difficult to comprehend today, was practiced in certain contexts, underscoring the intensity of their beliefs and the seriousness of their rituals. The Marquesan language and oral traditions also reveal a deep sense of identity. Stories of gods, demigods, and ancestral voyages linked the people to their land and to the broader Polynesian world. Linguistically, the Marquesan tongue is closely related to Hawaiian, a clue to the voyages that connected distant islands. Indeed, it is believed that settlers from the Marquesas played a role in the colonization of Hawaii, carrying with them traditions that would evolve in new environments. By the time Europeans first encountered the Marquesas in 1595, the culture was thriving, its valleys filled with people, its stone temples active with ritual. But contact brought devastating change. Disease swept through the population, warfare intensified with the introduction of new weapons, and the once thriving communities began to collapse. From an estimated population of tens of thousands, the Marquesans were reduced to only a few thousand by the 19th century. And yet, fragments of their legacy endure. The elaborate tattoos, once nearly extinguished, are being revived by modern Marquesans as a symbol of cultural pride. The great stone tiki figures still stand, weathered, but powerful, watching over valleys where their ancestors lived, and the oral traditions, passed down across generations, still speak of gods, voyages, and battles that shaped the islands. But mysteries remain. How exactly did the Marquesans manage to support such dense populations on such limited land? What meanings lay hidden in the intricate tattoo designs that once covered entire bodies? And to what extent did the Marquesas serve as a launching point for further exploration across the Pacific? The Marquesan culture stands as a testament to human adaptability and creativity. On islands where survival was a constant challenge, they built a society of striking intensity, artistic, spiritual, and formidable. Today, as their descendants reclaim and celebrate their heritage, the Marquesan legacy continues to speak across time, reminding us that even in the most isolated places, human culture finds ways to flourish. And as the winds still whistle through the deep valleys of the Marquesas, one can imagine the echoes of drums, the chants of priests, and the quiet persistence of a people whose story is far from finished. The Embori of Hawaiian, the traditions of the Embori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. There is a place remembered with reverence and longing. It is not a single island, nor a kingdom marked on maps, but a homeland of the spirit. They call it Hawaii, a place of origin, a place of return, and a place of mystery. For the Mbore, Hawaii is the ancestral homeland from which their people once journeyed across the Pacific. It is where the great canoes, or wakahurua, set sail upon the ocean, carrying families, crops, animals, and traditions that would form the foundation of Mbore society in Aotearoa. But Hawaii is more than a geographic point of departure, is a concept woven deeply into mythology, genealogy, and ritual. The story begins with Polynesian exploration. Between 1200 and 1300 CE, voyagers from East Polynesia sailed south and west, navigating by stars, ocean currents, and the flight of birds. They reached the vast and temperate islands of New Zealand, a land unlike the smaller, tropical islands of their homeland. There, they adapted, developing new strategies for survival in colder climates, crafting tools from hard stone, and building fortified villages known as payet. Even as they built new lives, they carried with them memories of Hawaii. In oral traditions, Hawaii is spoken of as both a physical homeland and a spiritual source. It is the place from which the ancestors came, and the place to which spirits return after death. To this day, Mbori recite genealogies, or wekapa, that link them back to the canoes of migration and, through those canoes, back to Hawaii. But where was Hawaii? For centuries, scholars and navigators have debated this question. Some argue it was in the Society Islands, perhaps Raitea in modern French Polynesia, which was once a religious and cultural center of eastern Polynesia. Others suggest the Cook Islands, particularly Rarotonga, which features prominently in traditions. Still others believe Hawaii is not one place, but a symbolic reference to the broader homeland of East Polynesia. Archaeological evidence provides some clues. Traces of distinctive Polynesian artifacts, stone adzes, fishhooks, and pottery styles link New Zealand back to East Polynesia. Linguistic similarities between Mbori and languages spoken in the Cook Islands, Tahiti, and the Marquesas point to shared ancestry. And radiocarbon dating of early settlements in New Zealand suggests a rapid migration from these northern islands around the 13th century. For the Mbori, however, Hawaii is more than an origin point in the distant past. It is a spiritual homeland, tied to the cycle of life and death. Many traditions speak of spirits traveling back to Hawaii after death, journeying along the northern tip of New Zealand, at Cape Ranga, where the roots of a sacred tree reach into the sea. From there, the spirits are said to dive into the ocean and make their way to Hawaii, rejoining the ancestors. This dual nature of Hawaii, both physical and spiritual, makes it a profound symbol of identity. It connects the Mbori not only to the land they inhabit, but to a vast oceanic network of kinship stretching across Polynesia. It reminds them that they are part of a story larger than New Zealand, one that spans thousands of kilometers of open ocean and centuries of human history. European contact in the 18th century brought new challenges. Disease, conflict, and colonization reshaped Mbori society. Yet the memory of Hawaii endured, preserved in chants, songs, and oral histories. Even as the world around them changed, the idea of Hawaii continued to anchor the Mbori to their ancestral past. Today, scholars, navigators, and cultural practitioners continue to explore the meaning of Hawaii. Modern wayfinders, using traditional Polynesian navigation techniques, have retraced the ancestral routes across the Pacific, linking Hawaii, Tahiti, the Cook Islands, and New Zealand. In doing so, they not only test historical theories but reconnect living Polynesian communities with their shared heritage. Still, the mystery lingers. Was Hawaii a specific island now known by another name, or was it a constellation of islands remembered as a single homeland? Was it meant to be mapped on the earth, or is it a place of memory, preserved in story and spirit rather than geography? What is certain is that the Mbori of Hawaii carried with them a vision powerful enough to sustain a people through one of the most daring migrations in human history. Across thousands of kilometers of uncharted ocean, guided only by nature, they voyaged to a new world, and yet, in their hearts, they never left Hawaii behind. And as the waves crashed eternally against the shores of Aotearoa, the question remains, where does Hawaii lie? On distant islands, waiting to be identified, or in the realm of ancestors, existing beyond maps, in the shared memory of a people who crossed the greatest ocean on earth? The Lemurian remnants beneath the waves of the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Some believe there are echoes of a forgotten world, a civilization spoken of not in historical chronicles, but in whispered myths, esoteric traditions, and speculative archaeology. It is called Lemuria, Lost Continent, a vanished cradle of humanity. The story of Lemuria begins not with ancient peoples, but with 19th century science. Zoologists studying lemurs, the small primates native to Madagascar and parts of Asia, struck by the puzzling distribution of these creatures. To explain it, some hypothesized the existence of a massive sunken landmass, once bridging the Indian Ocean. They called it Lemuria. At first, it was only a scientific theory, an attempt to solve a riddle of biology, but soon Lemuria leapt beyond zoology into the realm of mystery. Writers and mystics seized upon the idea, reimagining Lemuria not as a mere land bridge, but as an advanced civilization that had disappeared beneath the seas in some distant age. According to theosophical traditions of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Lemuria was said to have been the home of an early race of humanitable, spiritually advanced beings who lived in harmony with nature and possessed knowledge long forgotten by modern society. These accounts describe vast cities, crystal technologies, and wisdom carried across the ages into the traditions of surviving cultures. But does evidence exist for such a place? Scientists point out that the theory of Lemuria was made obsolete by plate tectonics, which explains the movement of continents and the distribution of species without the need for lost land masses. And yet, the myth has persisted, woven into folklore and spiritual narratives across the globe. In southern India, for instance, Tamil traditions speak of Kumari Kingdom, a sunken land where a great Tamil civilization once flourished before being swallowed by the sea. In Polynesia, legends tell of Hawaii, Mu, and other vanished homelands across the ocean. In Madagascar, ancestral stories recall a lost land once connected to their own. Could these be cultural memories of rising seas at the end of the last ice age, real floods transformed into myth? Archaeology offers tantalizing, though controversial, clues. Off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, divers have discovered vast stone formations, terraces, steps, and platforms that some believe to be the ruins of a lost civilization, though most geologists argue they are natural formations shaped by currents and erosion. Similarly, in the Indian Ocean, submerged structures off the coasts of India and Sri Lanka have fueled speculation of drowned cities, whether natural or man-made. Such discoveries remind us that the ocean holds many secrets. During the last ice age, sea levels were far lower than today. Vast coastal plains that once supported human life are now submerged beneath hundreds of feet of water. Somewhere in those drowned landscapes may lie the remains of early settlements, remnants of cultures erased by time. Inspiring memories later reimagined as Lemuria. The Lemurian legacy, real or imagined, also lives on in spiritual traditions. New Age beliefs speak of Lemuria as a civilization of wisdom keepers whose descendants are said to exist in hidden realms or within the collective memory of humanity. Some point to the similarities of myths across distant cultures, of floods, lost lands, and ancestral homelands as hints of a shared origin. Yet the question remains, are we dealing with history or with myth? Was Lemuria ever a physical place? Or is it a metaphor for the forgotten origins of humanity, our longing for a paradise lost, a time when we were more deeply connected to the earth and the cosmos? Science has dismissed the original geological concept of Lemuria, but the myth endures because it speaks to something deeper. Across the world, people have preserved memories of lands swallowed by the sea, whether Atlantis, Mu, Kumari, Kingdom, or Hawaii. And beneath those myths may lie truths not of vanished civilizations, but of the resilience of memory in the face of geological change. Perhaps the Lemurian remnants are not great temples hidden beneath the ocean, but the fragments of stories carried across generations, preserving a distant past when rising seas transformed the world. Or perhaps, just beyond the reach of modern exploration, ruins still wait to be found, silent beneath the waves. And so the legend of Lemuria continues, a reminder that human history is shaped as much by imagination as by evidence, and that between the continents we know, there may always linger the shadows of the lands we have lost. The Hainan Aborigines. The southern coast of China lies the island of Hainan, today known for its tropical climate, rice terraces, and bustling cities. But long before it became a modern province, Hainan was home to some of East Asia's oldest people's communities often referred to collectively as the Hainan Aborigines. Their story is one of survival, displacement, and cultural memory, shaped by both the land they inhabited and the waves of migration that surrounded them. Archaeological traces show that humans lived on Hainan as early as 7,000 years ago. Stone tools and pottery fragments, unearthed in caves and coastal sites, suggest a Neolithic culture closely tied to the rhythms of the land and sea. These early inhabitants relied on fishing, hunting, and shifting agriculture, carving out an existence in the island's dense forests and rugged mountains. Over centuries, Hainan became a meeting point of worlds. The island sits just off the coast of Guangdong, within reach of mainland China, yet close also to the wider currents of Southeast Asia. It is here that the Li people, considered the island's original inhabitants, emerged. The Li speak a language of the Taika-Dai family, linking them linguistically to peoples of mainland Southeast Asia. This has led scholars to see them as living remnants of ancient migrations that swept across southern China thousands of years ago. Chinese records first mention the aboriginal peoples of Hainan over 2,000 years ago. During the Qin and Han dynasties, imperial officials described the island as a frontier territory, inhabited by what they considered barbarian tribes. They were known for their tattooing practices, their independence, and their fierce resistance to outside rule. For centuries, the dense jungles of central Hainan allowed them to maintain autonomy, even as dynasties rose and fell on the mainland. Yet isolation did not mean invisibility. Trade routes passed through Hainan, bringing contact with Chinese settlers, merchants, and officials. Waves of migration gradually altered the island's demographics. By the Tang and Song dynasties, Chinese settlers were pushing southward, cultivating rice paddies and establishing towns along the coasts. The aboriginal communities retreated deeper into the mountains, where many Li still live today. The Aborigines' culture preserves echoes of these older worlds. Traditional Li textiles, dyed in indigo and decorated with intricate patterns, are renowned for their artistry. Their weaving techniques, particularly the use of double-sided brocade, have been passed down for generations. Some scholars suggesting that the motifs may encode ancient myths and clan histories. Their music, dance, and oral epics tell stories of origins, migrations, and ancestral spirits. One particularly striking tradition is tattooing. For centuries, Li women received tattoos as marks of maturity and identity, with patterns varying between clans. These tattoos, described in Chinese chronicles as early as the Han Dynasty, connected individuals to their lineage and served as visible links to cultural memory. Though the practice has largely faded in modern times, it remains a symbol of the deep antiquity of the Li people's traditions. But the Hainan Aborigines are not a single people. Alongside the Li, there are the Miao and other smaller groups, each with distinct languages and customs. Together, they represent the mosaic of indigenous cultures that predate large-scale Han Chinese settlement. Anthropologists have long studied their languages and oral traditions, seeing in them fragments of migration histories that reach far back into prehistory. The modern era brought profound changes. In the 20th century, roads, towns, and agricultural development reshaped Hainan. Many Aboriginal communities were assimilated into the broader society, their languages and traditions at risk of fading. Yet efforts have been made to preserve them. Ethnographic studies, cultural festivals, and recognition of Li brocade weaving as part of China's intangible cultural heritage. Still, mysteries remain. To what extent do the Hainan Aborigines preserve the lifeways of ancient southern Chinese populations, or their languages and customs, living records of a time when the ancestors of today's Southeast Asian peoples moved across the landscape? Archaeology continues to uncover hints of connections, ceramics, burial practices, and genetic studies that suggest Hainan was not isolated, but part of a wider network of migration and exchange across East and Southeast Asia. Some researchers have even speculated that Hainan may have served as a stepping stone in the ancient migrations that carried early humans southward, eventually reaching the Pacific and beyond. In this view, the Aboriginal peoples of Hainan are not only heirs to their own traditions, but also a window into the deep story of humanities spread across the world. Today, Hainan is changing rapidly. Modern highways cut through mountains. Once isolated for centuries, resorts line the coasts, drawing visitors from around the world. And yet, In the highland villages, songs are still sung in languages that trace back millennia, and weavers still craft patterns that link the present to a distant past. The non-Aborigines remain a living reminder that beneath the surface of the modern island lies a history both fragile and profound. Their traditions preserve echoes of migrations, encounters, and transformations that reach back long before written history, and so the mystery endures. Are these communities the last guardians of a cultural memory stretching to the dawn of human settlement in East Asia? Or are they but fragments of something even larger, remnants of a story still half hidden in the forests, mountains, and seas of Hainan? The Ban Chang culture in the northeast of Thailand. In the quiet village of Ban Chang lies one of the most important archaeological sites in Southeast Asia. What appears at first glance to be a rural landscape hides a story that stretches back thousands of years, a story that has reshaped our understanding of early human civilization in this region. It is the story of the Ban Chang culture, a prehistoric society whose legacy is preserved in fragments of clay, metal, and bone, buried in the soil for millennia. The discovery came almost by accident. In 1966, a student walking through Ban Chang tripped on a tree root and uncovered a fragment of pottery. Its surface was decorated with swirling red patterns, unlike anything local villagers had seen before. Soon after, archaeologists began to excavate the area. What they uncovered would astonish the world. Beneath the earth lay an ancient cemetery, filled with graves containing pottery, ornaments, tools, and human remains. The pottery, painted with elegant spirals and geometric designs, quickly became the defining symbol of this mysterious culture. But alongside the pottery were even more surprising finds. Evidence of early bronze tools and ornaments suggested that Ban Chang was home to one of the world's earliest bronze working communities. At the time, scholars believed that complex metallurgy reached Southeast Asia much later, around 500 BCE, but dating of Ban Chang artifacts initially suggested dates as early as 2000 BCE or even older. If true, this meant Ban Chang might rival Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China in the early use of bronze. Rewriting global prehistory, the news captured international attention. Some hailed Ban Chang as the birthplace of Southeast Asian civilization, a cradle of innovation hidden far from the centers of the ancient world. But as more excavations and studies were conducted, the dates became the subject of debate. Later research suggested that bronze metallurgy at Ban Chang may have developed closer to 1100 BCE, still early, but not as revolutionary as once thought. Yet the mystery remains. Whether the earliest or not, Ban Chang reveals a society of remarkable sophistication. The graves show evidence of social organization. Offerings of ornaments and tools suggest distinctions in wealth and status. Glass beads, seashells, and exotic materials point to networks of trade that stretched across Southeast Asia. The pottery itself, with its flowing red designs, reflects a sense of aesthetic beauty, not merely utility. What kind of people lived here? Archaeological evidence indicates that Ban Chang was an agricultural society. Rice cultivation formed the backbone of daily life, supplemented by hunting, fishing, and animal husbandry. Tools of bone and bronze hint at farming practices that supported a growing population. The presence of spindle whorls suggests weaving, while ornaments made of bronze and glass reflect both skill and artistry. The burials provide glimpses into belief and ritual. Many of the dead were interred with pottery, sometimes containing food or drink, offerings for the journey into the afterlife. Infants were buried with care, their graves surrounded by protective goods. Such practices reveal not only a concern for the spiritual world, but also an enduring respect for ancestors. Over centuries, the Ban Chang culture evolved. By the Iron Age, around 500 BCE, the people of this region were forging new tools, weapons, and ornaments. The transition from bronze to iron reflects wider technological changes sweeping across Asia. But Ban Chang retained its distinctive identity, its pottery, its burial customs, its quiet place in the unfolding human story. Today, Ban Chang is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, celebrated as the most important prehistoric settlement discovered in Southeast Asia. Its museum displays the pottery and artifacts, allowing visitors to step back into a world that flourished thousands of years before recorded history. Yet for all that we have learned, many questions remain unanswered. Was Ban Chang truly an independent center of innovation, or did its metallurgy and artistic styles spread from elsewhere? What role did it play in the networks that linked early Southeast Asian cultures? And why did such a vibrant society eventually fade into obscurity, its memory preserved only in the earth beneath a small Thai village? The Ban Chang culture reminds us that the roots of civilization are not confined to the valleys of the Nile or the plains of Mesopotamia. Across the globe, communities rose, adapted, and thrived, each leaving behind their own traces of ingenuity and beauty. Ban Chang spirals painted in red clay still speak to us across the ages, symbols of a culture both mysterious and enduring, and perhaps, somewhere in the soil, yet unexcavated, more secrets wait to be uncovered, ready to reshape once again our understanding of the deep past. The Ban Nun Wat culture in the fertile plains of northeast Thailand lies a quiet village named Ban Nun Wat. To pass through it today, one might see rice paddies stretching toward the horizon, dotted with water buffalo and framed by distant hills. Yet beneath these fields lies a hidden record of human history. For more than 4,000 years, people lived, farmed, and buried their dead here. Their legacy, known as the Ban Nan Wat culture, offers one of the most detailed windows into prehistoric life in mainland Southeast Asia. Archaeologists first began to explore Ban Nan Wat in the late 20th century. Intrigued by pottery fragments and burial mounds scattered across the land, systematic excavations revealed layer upon layer of occupation, with some levels dating back to around 1750 BCE. Few sites in the region preserve such a long and continuous sequence, making Ban Nan Wat a key to understanding how societies in Southeast Asia transformed over millennia. The earliest evidence points to a community of Neolithic farmers. These first settlers cultivated rice in the fertile floodplains, supplementing their diet with hunting, fishing, and gathering. Their toolstone adzes, bone implements, and grinding stones speak to the rhythms of an agricultural life. Burial sites from this period show individuals laid to rest with modest offerings, simple pottery vessels, ornaments of shell and stone, tokens of respect for the dead. But as the centuries unfolded, Ban Nan Wat changed. Around 1000 BCE, the site entered the Bronze Age, and with it came a striking shift. Graves from this period are far richer, filled with bronze axes, bangles, and intricate ornaments. Some burials contain dozens of offerings, suggesting rising social stratification. For the first time, wealth and status were clearly inscribed into the treatment of the dead. The pottery of Ban Nan Wat is among its most distinctive features. Painted with spirals, curves, and geometric designs, the ceramics echo the artistry of neighboring sites such as Ban Chang. But at Ban Nan Wat, the long sequence of occupation allows scholars to trace how styles evolved, shifting from simple utilitarian forms to elaborately decorated vessels placed as grave goods. These pots are not just containers, they are silent witnesses to the cultural transitions that shaped the community. The arrival of metallurgy raises questions. Did the knowledge of bronze casting emerge locally, or was it introduced through long-distance exchange? The evidence at Ban Nan Wat suggests participation in wider networks of trade and technology. Ornaments of marine shell hint at contact with coastal regions, while certain pottery styles echo traditions far beyond the Korat Plateau. This was not an isolated settlement. It was a node in a web of interaction stretching across Southeast Asia. By around 500 BC, Ban Nan Wat had entered the Iron Age. Iron tools, weapons, and ornaments appear in the archaeological record, reflecting technological advances that further transformed daily life. The burials of this era are particularly striking. Some graves contain vast numbers of offerings, including bronze and iron jewelry, glass beads, and finely made ceramics. Others contain only a few simple vessels. The contrast suggests a society with pronounced social hierarchies, where elite individuals were celebrated in death with symbols of power and prestige. And yet, through all these changes, Ban Nan Wat retained a sense of continuity. Rice remained central to the community's subsistence, anchoring its people to the rhythms of the land and the cycles of water. The graves, whether rich or modest, reveal a deep concern with honoring the dead, an enduring tradition that speaks to spiritual beliefs passed down over generations. What sets Ban Nan Wat apart is not only its longevity, but also its ability to tell a continuous story, from Neolithic farmers to Bronze Age chiefs and Iron Age elites. The site traces the rise of social complexity in mainland Southeast Asia. It shows how small communities gradually became stratified societies, shaped by technological innovation and long-distance exchange. Today, Ban Nan Wat stands as one of the most extensively excavated sites in Southeast Asia. Its artifacts are preserved in museums, its story told by archaeologists who have painstakingly uncovered more than 600 burials. Yet despite this wealth of information, mysteries remain. What were the exact origins of bronze casting here? How far did Ban Nan Wat's trade networks extend? And why, after centuries of prosperity, did the site eventually decline? As modern villages grow over the ancient land, the echoes of Ban Nan Wat still linger in the painted pottery, in the silent graves, and in the enduring rice fields that link past and present. The Ban Nan Wat culture reminds us that history is not always found in grand monuments or ancient cities. Sometimes, it is preserved quietly beneath the soil of an ordinary village. And as archaeologists continue to uncover its secrets, we are left to wonder what other hidden layers of Southeast Asia's past remain buried, waiting to be revealed. The Dong Son culture in the river valleys of northern Vietnam, where the waters of the Red River flow toward the Gulf of Tonkin. A civilization once thrived that would shape the identity of Southeast Asia for centuries. Known as the Dong Son culture, it emerged more than 2,500 years ago and left behind artifacts of astonishing beauty and craftsmanship. At the heart of its legacy lies an enduring symbol, the bronze drum, an object both artistic and ceremonial, echoing with the voice of a people whose full story is still shrouded in mystery. The discovery of the Dong Son culture began in the early 20th century in the village of Dongsun, near Than Hoa. Archaeologists uncovered a trove of bronze objects buried beneath the earth. Among them were drums, axes, daggers, and ornaments, each revealing a high level of metallurgical skill. The sophistication of these artifacts stunned scholars, challenging assumptions about the technological capabilities of Southeast Asia in the late prehistoric period. At its height, the Dong Son culture flourished between 1000 BCE and 200 CE. It was an era defined by the mastery of bronze, a metal that transformed both warfare and ritual life. The bronze drums, some over a meter in diameter, decorated with intricate designs, concentric circles, images of birds in flight, warriors in procession, and boats gliding across rivers. These motifs reveal a society deeply connected to water, ritual, and warfare. The purpose of the drums remains a subject of debate. Were they used to summon warriors, to mark rituals of fertility and harvest, or to project the authority of chiefs and kings? Their sound would have carried across valleys, a deep resonant tone uniting community gatherings. What is certain is their significance. Even centuries later, bronze drums continued to be prized in many parts of Southeast Asia, passing into the traditions of the Karen, the Dayak, and other peoples. The Dong Son people were not only they were skilled farmers, cultivating rice in the fertile floodplains of the Red River Delta. Their agricultural success allowed for population growth and the rise of complex social structures. Hunting, fishing, and animal husbandry complemented their diet, while pottery and textiles suggest a society rich in both utility and artistry. Archaeological evidence paints a picture of a hierarchical community. Burials vary from simple graves to elaborate tombs filled with bronze weapons, ornaments, and drums, clear markers of status. In some, the dead are accompanied by miniature boats and tools, offerings for the afterlife. Such practices reveal a belief system that honored both ancestors and the journey beyond death. But the Dong Son were not isolated. Their drums and bronze artifacts have been found across vast distances from southern China to Indonesia, from Thailand to the islands of Malaysia. This distribution speaks to far-reaching trade networks and cultural influence, positioning the Dong Son as central players in the exchange systems of early Southeast Asia. They were navigators of rivers and seas, their boats often depicted on the drums themselves, symbols of both practical mobility and cultural expansion. That the question of identity remains. Who were the Dong Son people? Many scholars link them to the LCC Viet, a group mentioned in early Chinese records, said to have lived in the Red River Delta. The Dong Son culture may have been the foundation upon which later Vietnamese civilization was built. Yet, because written records are scarce, much of what we know is inferred from artifacts alone. The end of the Dongsan culture coincides with the rise of outside powers. By the late centuries BCE, Chinese dynasties expanded southward, bringing new technologies, administrative systems, and military might. Some believe the Dongsan way of life was gradually absorbed into larger political entities, while others suggest it persisted in localized traditions long after official conquest. What cannot be denied is the influence of Dongsan craftsmanship. The bronze drums, in particular, remain cultural treasures, revered not only in Vietnam but throughout Southeast Asia. Today, they are symbols of heritage, displayed in museums and celebrated in art, still carrying the echoes of a civilization that mastered metal and ritual in equal measure, and yet mysteries linger. How did the Dongsan achieve such metallurgical precision without written records or centralized states as we know them today? Were the designs on the drums purely decorative, or do they encode messages, calendars, or cosmological maps? And how far did their influence truly reach, as their artifacts continue to surface thousands of kilometers away? The Dongsan culture reminds us that history is not only written in texts, but inscribed in metal, clay, and ritual. In the deep resonance of a bronze drum, one can still imagine the gatherings of an ancient people, the sound rolling across the waters of the Red River, carrying with it both power and mystery. And perhaps, somewhere in the unexplored soil of Vietnam, more drums lie buried, waiting to be uncovered, waiting to add their voices to the story of a people who forged their legacy in bronze. The Fulanese port cities along the winding channels of the Mekong Delta, where river meets sea and water becomes a highway, a civilization once thrived that drew the attention of merchants from India, China, and beyond. Known to history as this ancient polity flourished from the 1st to the 6th century CE. At its heart were the port cities' gateways of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. They were places where the movement of goods was matched by the movement of ideas, shaping the earliest known kingdom of Southeast Asia. The first records of Funan come not from its own people, but from the Chinese. In dynastic histories of the 3rd century CE, Funan is described as a powerful maritime kingdom, ruled by kings who commanded fleets of ships and controlled networks of trade. Chinese envoys wrote of canals and embankments, of markets bustling with goods, and of rulers who welcomed foreign traders with open hands. These accounts, though filtered through outside eyes, remain some of the earliest written glimpses into the life of Funan cities. Archaeological discoveries in southern Vietnam and Cambodia confirm much of this picture. Sites such as GCEO, with its sprawling canals and remnants of stone foundations, reveal the scale of Funan's urban centers. From the air, ancient waterways stretch across the delta like veins, linking inland towns to the South China Sea. These canals were more than feats of engineering. They were lifelines of commerce, allowing ships to move rice, spices, textiles, and precious goods through a vast network of exchange. The port cities of Funan were cosmopolitan. Excavations at Oak Aoabe uncovered Roman intellos, Indian beads, Persian glass, and Chinese ceramics. Such artifacts testify to the reach of Funan's trade connections, stretching from the Mediterranean world to East Asia. Here, merchants could find goods as diverse as ivory, gold, aromatic resins, and exotic woods, all moving through warehouses and markets that turned Funan into a crossroads of civilizations. But trade was only part of the story. The Funanese ports were also centers of cultural transformation. From India came new religious ideas, Hinduism and Buddhism, along with the Sanskrit language and the concepts of kingship that would shape Southeast Asia for centuries. Inscriptions and artifacts suggest that local rulers adopted these traditions selectively, blending them with indigenous beliefs to create something uniquely their own. Temples rose alongside warehouses, symbols of a society where commerce and spirituality were deeply intertwined. The social fabric of these cities was complex. Merchants and artisans thrived in the bustling port districts, while farmers in the surrounding hinterland supplied rice and food to sustain the growing populations. At the top, rulers presided over networks of tribute and alliance, their authority reinforced by both wealth and ritual. The discovery of ornate jewelry and ritual objects hints at the power of elites who used both material splendor and spiritual symbolism to legitimize their rule. Yet Funan was not a single city, but a constellation of them: Gceo, Angkor, Boré, and other settlements linked by rivers and sea routes. Together, they formed a maritime hub that rivaled any in the ancient world. And like all hubs, they were vulnerable to change. By the 6th century CE, Chinese records suggest that Funan had begun to decline. New powers, such as the Chenla kingdom to the north, rose to prominence. The reasons remained debated. Was it political fragmentation, shifting trade routes, or the silting of canals that choked the lifelines of commerce? The ruins of the Funanese ports still whisper of their former vitality. At Gceo, fragments of ceramics lie buried alongside stone foundations, remnants of a city that once welcomed traders from half a world away. The canals, though silent, remain etched into the land, testimony to the ingenuity of a people who turned water into wealth. The story of the Funanese port cities is not just one of trade, but of transformation. They were among the first in Southeast Asia to embrace the opportunities of maritime exchange, setting patterns that would endure through later empires from Srivijaya to Angkor. And though Funan itself eventually vanished, the echoes of its ports remain in the traditions, languages, and spiritual landscapes of the region. Even now, questions linger. How were the port cities governed, and how far did Funan's influence truly extend? Were its rulers central monarchs, or a network of local lords bound by trade and ritual? And what secrets still lie beneath the delta's soil, waiting for archaeologists to unearth? The Funanese port cities stand as a reminder that civilizations are not only defined by their monuments, but by their openness, the ability to connect, adapt, and thrive at the meeting points of worlds. And in the quiet waterways of the Mekong Delta, one can still imagine the sails of ships appearing on the horizon, carrying with them the wealth and wonder that once made Funan the first great kingdom of Southeast Asia. The Champa city-states sail along the central coast of modern-day Vietnam, where mountains descend into the South China Sea. There once flourished a constellation of kingdoms that rivaled the great maritime powers of Asia, known collectively as Champa. These city-states emerged as early as the 2nd century CE and endured for more than 1,000 years. They were kingdoms of sailors and traders, of temples and towers, whose history is written not only in stone, but in the shifting tides of the sea they depended upon. The Champa were not one kingdom, but many, spread across the coastal plains. Their polities were bound together less by central authority than by shared culture, language, and religion. Scholars divide their history into regions: Indrapura in the north, Amarapati, Vijaya, Kothara and Panduranga in the south. Each city-state rose and fell in its own time, often competing, sometimes uniting, and always interacting with the great powers that surrounded them. At the heart of Champa's world was the sea. The Cham people were among the finest sailors of their age, their ships carrying goods across the South China Sea and beyond. From India and the Middle East came textiles, beads, and spices. From China came silk and ceramics. In return, Champa exported aromatic woods, ivory, and precious resins, such as frankincense and agar wood substances, prized in temples from India to Arabia. The ports of Champa were cosmopolitan crossroads, where merchants from distant lands mingled with local traders in bustling markets. The cultural imprint of India was especially strong. By the 4th century CE, Hinduism had become the dominant religion of Champa, shaping its art, architecture, and kingship. Towering brick sanctuaries were built in honor of Shiva, Vishnu, and other deities. The most famous of these stands at Mysteryies, a complex of red brick towers nestled in a lush valley, where rulers once performed rituals of legitimacy and devotion. Inscriptions carved in Sanskrit and Old Kham speak of divine kingship, of wars fought, and of offerings made to the gods. But Champa was not only Hindu. Over time, Buddhism also took root, leaving behind statues and relics that testify to the region's religious diversity. By the later centuries, Islam too found its way to Champa, carried by merchants from the Indian Ocean. This layering of traditions created a society at once local and cosmopolitan, rooted in the coast but open to the wider world. The politics of the Champa city-states were as turbulent as the seas they sailed. At times they were allies of China, sending tribute missions to the Tang and Song dynasties. At other times, they clashed with their neighbors. The Khmer Empire to the west was both a trading partner and a rival, and wars between the two left deep marks on both civilizations. To the north, the Vietnamese states of Viet rose in strength, and over centuries, the balance of power shifted steadily against the Cam. One of the most dramatic episodes came in the 10th century, when the Cam launched raids against coastal China, seizing wealth and captives. Yet, the tide of history was turning. In the 15th century, Viet forces launched a devastating campaign, capturing the capital of Vijaya in 1471. Tens of thousands of Cam were killed or displaced, and Champa's power was irreparably broken. What remained endured in the southernmost polity for several more centuries, until it too was absorbed. Still, the legacy of the Champa city-states is visible today. The brick towers of Mysteryies, though weathered by time and war, rise as monuments to a lost kingdom. Cam sculptured delicate carvings of gods, dancers, and mythic creatures are preserved in museums, offering glimpses into a refined artistic tradition. And among the Cam people who survive in Vietnam and Cambodia, memories of their ancestors remain alive in language, music, and ritual. Yet, much about Champa remains uncertain. How were its city-states governed in detail? What internal dynamics drove their rise and fall? Archaeology has revealed temples and trade goods, but much of their daily life and political structure remains hidden. Beneath layers of earth and legend, the story of Champa is one of resilience and adaptation, of a people who carved out a place between empires and thrived on the opportunities of the sea. But it is also a story of fragility, of how kingdoms built on maritime trade could flourish for centuries, only to fade when tides of power shifted around them. Today, standing among the ruins of Mysteryies, one can still imagine the smoke of rituals rising into the valley air, the chants of priests echoing against the hills, and beyond them, the sound of waves that once carried the ships of Champa to every corner of the Indian Ocean world. And yet, questions linger. If more of their records had survived, would we know Champa as a fragmented set of city-states, or as something closer to a unified kingdom of the sea? What secrets lie buried still in the delta soils and coastal plains, waiting to redefine our understanding of this maritime civilization? The Champa city-states remind us that history is not a single story, but a mosaic of many voices, some preserved, others lost to the tide. And in the silence of their ruined temples, the mystery of their rise and fall still endures. The early Jomon culture beneath the dense forests and along the rugged coastlines of ancient Japan, a people once thrived whose way of life would endure for millennia. They left behind no great palaces, no towering monuments. Instead, their legacy lies in quiet earthen mounds, in delicate shards of pottery, and in traces of villages buried beneath the soil. This was the early Jomon culture, one of the world's earliest traditions of settled life, a society that bridges the distant gap between nomadic hunting bands and agricultural civilizations. The Jomon period takes its name from a simple detail: the cordmark impressions pressed into their pottery. These decorations, made by pressing twisted ropes into wet clay, were among the first signs of an artistic impulse tied to everyday life. Pottery of the Jomon is among the oldest ever discovered, dating back as early as 14,000 BCE, but it was during the early Jomon, roughly from 5000 to 2500 BCE, that this culture began to take a more recognizable shape. That at this time, the climate was warmer than today, and the rising seas carved deep bays and inlets across the Japanese archipelago. Forests of chestnut, oak, and walnut spread widely, offering food in abundance. Shellfish, fish, and game supplemented the harvest of nuts and fruits. Archaeological evidence suggests that the early Jomon people lived in semi-permanent villages, often near rivers or coasts, where resources were plentiful. Pit dwellings, shallow, circular depressions covered with thatched roofs formed small clusters, hinting at communities bound by kinship and ritual. Their pottery reveals more than utility. The early Jomon crafted deep, rounded vessels used for boiling and storing food. Many were decorated with cordmark patterns, spirals, or impressions of shells. Some were elaborately adorned, suggesting that pottery was not only practical, but also symbolic, perhaps tied to ritual feasting or social identity. The presence of stone tools, grinding stones, polished axes, and projectile points shows how they adapted to their environment. Grinding stones were used to process nuts, removing bitter toxins before cooking, while axes enabled woodland management, shaping the forests that sustained them. the abundance of shell-midden heaps of discarded shells, bones, and pottery. Fragments provides a detailed record of their diet and daily life, frozen in time beneath layers of earth. But the early German culture was more than survival. There is evidence of ritual and belief, expressed through dogger figurines, small clay figures, often depicting human-like shapes with exaggerated features. Their exact purpose remains mysterious. Some scholars suggest they were fertility symbols, others that they served in rituals of healing or protection. Whatever their meaning, they testify to a symbolic world where the spiritual was inseparable from the material. Burial practices, too, hint at ritual. Graves have been found within or near settlements, sometimes accompanied by grave goods, pottery, or tools placed with the dead. This suggests a sense of continuity between the living and the ancestors, and perhaps an early form of community identity tied to land and lineage. The early Jomon were not isolated. Stone materials from distant regions indicate networks of exchange and movement, connecting groups across the islands. Obsidian, prized for its sharp edges, was carried long distances, linking coastal communities with those in the interior. These networks suggest not only trade, but also the movement of ideas, technologies, and stories across the landscape. Yet, for all their resilience, the early Jomon lived in balance with an environment that could change swiftly. Rising sea levels periodically reshaped their coastlines, flooding settlements and forcing communities to adapt. Some sites show evidence of abandonment, while others reveal continuity villages rebuilt again and again, testament to their determination to remain rooted in familiar places. What is perhaps most striking about the early Jomon is the longevity of their way of life. For thousands of years, they persisted without adopting large-scale agriculture, relying instead on a deep knowledge of seasonal cycles and ecological diversity. This stands in contrast to the narrative of inevitable transition from foraging to farming seen elsewhere in the world. For the Jomon, stability lay not in expansion but in adaptation. Even today, their presence lingers. Excavated pots and dogger figurines rest in museums, their surfaces still carrying the marks of hands that shaped them 5,000 years ago. In the shell middens, we see traces of meals shared, seasons passed, and lives lived in quiet resilience. And in the forests of Japan, where chestnuts and oaks still grow, one can imagine the rhythms of the world they knew, harvesting in autumn, fishing in summer, gathering by firelight in the long winters. But mysteries remain. Did the dogger truly embody gods or spirits, or were they reflections of human hopes and fears? Were the Jomon the ancestors of later Japanese peoples, or did waves of newcomers gradually reshape the archipelago? And what lessons might their long, sustainable coexistence with the land hold for the modern world? The early Jomon culture may not have built empires or cities, but their legacy endures in something subtler, the reminder that civilization is not always measured in scale or conquest, but in the quiet endurance of a way of life. In the silence of their pottery and the shadows of their villages, the story of the Jomon continues to whisper, inviting us to imagine a world where humanity lived not in domination of nature, but in dialogue with it. The Yayoi culture in the fertile river plains of Japan. More than 2,000 years ago, a profound transformation began to take shape. It was a change so decisive that it would alter the course of the island's history forever. This was the dawn of the Yayoi culture, a society that emerged around 900 BCE and lasted until the 3rd century CE, bridging the ancient Jomon world of hunter-gatherers with the beginnings of Japan's early states. The Yayoi culture takes its name from a neighborhood in Tokyo where pottery of a new and distinctive style was first discovered in the late 19th century. These ceramics, simpler and plainer than the ornate Jomon wares, marked the arrival of new traditions. But the true hallmark of the Yayoi was not pottery. It was the introduction of wet rice agriculture, a technology that would reshape the landscape, economy, and society of Japan. The origins of the Yayoi remain the subject of debate. Archaeology suggests a mixture of continuity and migration. Some evidence points to waves of newcomers from the Asian mainland, bringing with them techniques of farming, metallurgy, and weaving. Others argue that these innovations spread gradually through trade and cultural contact. Whatever the process, the impact was unmistakable. Rice, grown in carefully irrigated paddies, became the foundation of subsistence. With it came food surpluses, population growth, and the beginnings of social hierarchy. The shift from foraging to farming was revolutionary. Excavations reveal irrigation ditches, wooden tools, and rice fields that stretched across lowland valleys. Farming communities flourished, supporting larger populations than ever before. Where Jomon settlements had been small and relatively egalitarian, Yayoi villages grew larger and more complex. Some became fortified with moats and embankments, evidence of conflict in an era of increasing competition for land and resources. Net metal, too, transformed Yayoi life. Bronze and iron were introduced from the continent, each serving distinct roles. Bronze was often reserved for ritual objects, bells, known as dotaku, adorned with intricate patterns, buried in clusters as offerings to the deities of agriculture and fertility. Iron, meanwhile, was practical, used for tools and weapons that gave farmers and warriors alike new advantages. These metals deepened the divide between ordinary villagers and elites. As control of resources became a source of power, the burial record speaks clearly of this emerging hierarchy. Early Yayoi graves were modest, but by the Middle Period, keyhole-shaped tombs and mound burials began to appear, filled with weapons, ornaments, and ritual items. These graves suggest the rise of chieftains' figures who commanded not only wealth, but also religious authority. Standing at the center of increasingly stratified communities, daily life, however, was still tied to the rhythms of the land. Houses, built of wood and thatch, clustered in villages near water sources. People raised rice, millet, and barley, while continuing to hunt, fish, and gather. Women spun thread from hemp and wove textiles, while craftsmen worked wood, stone, and clay. Tools grew sharper, houses sturdier, and pottery plainer-shaped, less for ritual display than for everyday utility. Religion and ritual held a central place. The dotaku bells, cast in bronze and often decorated with images of animals, plants, and farming scenes, suggest ceremonies tied to fertility and harvest. These objects were buried deliberately, sometimes in remote hills, hinting at collective rites meant to ensure prosperity and balance with the natural world. Some scholars see in these practices the seeds of what would later become Shinto traditions, rooted in reverence for nature and ancestral spirits. The Yayoi were not isolated. Across the waters of the Korea Strait, contacts with the Korean peninsula, and even parts of China brought new ideas and goods. Han Dynasty records mention people from the Japanese archipelago, describing them as organized into numerous chiefdoms, sending tribute to the mainland. These glimpses from afar confirm what archaeology reveals, that by the Yayoi period, Japan was entering the wider East Asian sphere of exchange and diplomacy. One of the most intriguing accounts comes from Chinese chronicles, written in the 3rd century CE. They describe a realm ruled by a shaman queen named Himiko, who governed with spiritual authority and maintained ties with the Wei dynasty of China. Scholars debate whether Himiko's realm was part of the Yayoi culture or a successor, but her story reflects the consolidation of power that began in this age, a process that would eventually give rise to the Yamato state. The Yayoi era ended around the 3rd century CE, but its legacy was profound. It established the agricultural base that would sustain Japan for centuries. It laid the foundations of social hierarchy, ritual authority, and political centralization. And it introduced technologies, rice farming, metallurgy, textile weaving that reshaped not only the economy, but the very identity of the Japanese archipelago. Yet, mysteries remain. Who exactly were the first bearers of Yayoi culture? Were they migrants from the continent, or descendants of Jomon people adapting to new ways of life? How did spiritual practices evolve, from bronze bells in the fields to the great shrines of later Japan? And what truths lie buried beneath the mounds and paddies that still mark the land today? The Yayoi culture stands as a turning point, a bridge between worlds, between foragers and farmers, between clans and kingdoms, between isolation and the vast networks of East Asia. And as we look back at their fields, their bells, and their tombs, we glimpse the roots of a civilization that was only just beginning to take shape. The Satsuman culture in the northern reaches of the Japanese archipelago, where winters are long and forests stretch deep. A culture once thrived that bridged the worlds, the indigenous traditions of ancient Hokkaido and the growing influence of Japan to the south. This was the Satsuman culture, a society that flourished between the 7th and 12th centuries CE, and whose legacy is often seen as a forerunner to the later Innu people. The story of the Satsuman begins with a transformation. Before them, the island of Hokkaido was home to the Okhotsk culture, a seafaring people tied closely to the northern Pacific. But around the 7th century, new lifeways began to emerge. Influenced by contact with the Tohoku region of Honshu, the northern tip of Japan's main island, archaeologists call this blend the Satsuman culture, named after pottery unearthed in the Satsuman neighborhood of Sapporo. At its heart, Satsuman life combined old and new. They continued to hunt deer, fish the rivers, and gather the rich resources of Hokkaido's forests, yet they also adopted agriculture. Evidence of millet, barley, and buckwheat cultivation shows that farming, introduced from the south, had taken root in the north. This dual economy, both foraging and farming, gave them resilience, allowing villagers to sustain themselves across changing seasons. Their settlements reveal a world both modest and ordered. Pit-dwelling sunken homes insulated against the cold clustered together in communities, often near rivers or coasts. Storage pits suggest surplus food, while hearths at the center of homes hint at the social importance of fire, a source of both warmth and ritual. The most visible markers of the Satsuman are their pottery and tools. Their ceramics, plain but functional, were tempered with sand and decorated with cord marks, reflecting continuity with earlier traditions. Stone tools remained common, yet iron artifacts appear as well, showing exchange and adaptation to technologies spreading from Honshu. Among these items, arrowheads, fishing gear, and farming implements reveal a versatile way of life, one attuned to both land and water. But perhaps the most intriguing finds are ritual in nature. Clay figurines and certain decorated vessels suggest that spiritual life played a strong role in Satsuman society. Animal bones found in ceremonial contexts point to practices of offering or sacrifice, resonant with later Innu beliefs in kami spirits inhabiting animals, plants, and natural forces. The relationship between the Satsuman and their neighbors was complex. To the south, they traded with people of the emerging Heian state in Honshu, exchanging local goods such as furs, fish, and marine products for iron tools and ornaments. To the north, they overlapped with the remnants of the Okhotsk culture, blending traditions in ways that remain visible in the archaeological record. Out of this fusion, many scholars believe, arose the cultural foundations of the Ainu, whose society would dominate Hokkaido in later centuries. Burial practices, too, reveal clues to identity. Unlike the monumental Kofun mounds of the south, Satsuman burials were more modest, often involving simple inhumations with grave goods, such as beads, pottery, or weapons. These graves suggest a community-based identity rather than centralized authority, pointing to a society with leaders but without kings. The environment shaped their world profoundly. Hokkaido's climate demanded flexibility. Harsh winters tested survival, while rivers and coasts offered salmon, herring, and shellfish in abundance. Archaeological sites contain layers of fish, bones, and shells, showing how vital the sea was to their diet and trade. In this interplay of forest and water, the Satsuman found balance, crafting a culture that was neither fully agricultural nor entirely foraging, but something unique in between. Yet, the story of the Satsuman is also a story of transition. By the 12th century, their distinct material culture began to give way to that of the emerging Innu, whose language, spirituality, and way of life carried echoes of both Satsuman and Okhotsk traditions. To some scholars, the Satsuman represent a crucial bridge and evolutionary stage in the long history of northern Japan's indigenous peoples. To others, they remain an enigma, their exact place in the lineage of the Innu still debated. Even today, traces of the Satsuman endure beneath the soils of Hokkaido. Pottery fragments, iron tools, and the outlines of pit dwellings whisper of lives once lived, of hunters who sowed grain, of farmers who prayed to spirits, of traders who bridged islands and seas. Their world was one of transition, where the boundaries between old and new, north and south, human and spirit, blurred into something both fragile and enduring. But questions remain. Did the Satsuman see themselves as distinct from the Okhotsk, or as inheritors of their legacy? How much of their language, their ritual, and their worldview lives on in the Ainu who followed them? And what unseen stories lie buried still in the frost-hardened earth of Hokkaido? The Satsuman culture may not be remembered in chronicles or carved in monuments, Yet, in the quiet remains of their villages, they remind us of a deeper truth, that history is not always written in empires and kingdoms, but in the small communities who carried traditions forward, shaping the roots of cultures still alive today. The Emishi people in the far reaches of northern Honshu, beyond the frontiers of the early Japanese state, there lived a people both feared and admired. They were hunters, horsemen, and warriors, dwelling in the rugged mountains and fertile plains of Tohoku for centuries. They resisted the expansion of the Yamato court. To their neighbors, they were known as the Emisia people, whose identity remains one of the enduring mysteries of Japan's ancient past. The earliest references to the Emishi appear in Japanese chronicles, such as the Nihon Shoki and the Shoku Nihonji, written in the 8th century. These texts portray them as outsiders, untamed, and uncivilized, inhabiting lands too wild to be ruled. Yet archaeological and linguistic clues suggest a different story. The Emishi may have been descendants of the Jomon and Yayoi peoples who adapted to the north, mixing hunting, farming, and herding into a flexible way of life. Some scholars even argue they spoke a language related to the Ainu, linking them to broader northern traditions. Their world was shaped by both forest and steppe. Excavations reveal pit dwellings and villages, but also evidence of horseback riding, a practice not common among early Japanese. The Emishi were skilled equestrians, using swift-mounted archery to outmaneuver heavily armed imperial troops. This tactical advantage made them formidable in battle and allowed them to resist for centuries. For the Yamato court, the Emishi lands represented both a challenge and an opportunity. The fertile plains of northern Honshu promised resources, grain, iron, and horses that the growing state desired. Beginning in the 7th century, imperial campaigns sought to subjugate the Emishi and bring their territories under control. Fortresses were built along the frontier, armies dispatched northward, and alliances forged with some Emishi clans against others. But conquest was never simple. Battles raged for generations. The Emishi fought not as a unified kingdom but as decentralized groups, sometimes allying with the court, sometimes resisting fiercely. One figure stands out in the chronicles: Atarui, a war leader of the late 8th century. In 789 CE, Ataru's forces dealt a devastating defeat to imperial troops at the Battle of Koromo River, demonstrating the resilience and strength of Emishi resistance. Though Atarui was eventually captured and executed, his memory lingers as a symbol of a people who refused to yield. Daily life among the Emishi was as diverse as their strategies of survival. Archaeological sites show reliance on hunting deer and bear, fishing rivers rich with salmon, and cultivating crops like millet. Horses played a central role not only in war but in trade and herding. Their pottery, simple and utilitarian, continued traditions inherited from earlier cultures, while iron tools suggest contact and exchange with the Japanese to the south. Religion, too, reveals continuity with northern traditions. The Emishi revered natural spirits, animals, and landscapes, in ways reminiscent of the animistic practices that later came to define Innu belief. Ritual deposits of weapons and animal remains hint at ceremonies tied to both war and fertility. Over time, however, the tide of history turned. By the 9th century, the Yamato state intensified its campaigns. Through military conquest, assimilation, and political strategy, the frontier pushed northward. Fortresses like Taga Castle served as bases for colonization, and gradually, Emishi territories were absorbed. Some Emishi were relocated to serve as frontier guards, while others were integrated into Japanese society, adopting new language and customs. And yet, the Emishi did not vanish. Traces of their identity lingered in the cultural fabric of northern Japan. Their horse-riding traditions influenced the development of Japanese cavalry. Their resistance shaped frontier policies and fortified the early state, and their possible ties to the Ainu remind us that they were part of a broader tapestry of northern peoples, whose voices remain largely absent from written records. The mystery of the Emishi endures, because their story is told mainly through the eyes of their adversaries. The chronicles portray them as barbarians, yet archaeology paints a richer picture of a people who were adaptable, skilled, and deeply rooted in their land. Were they an isolated remnant of Jomon ancestry, a branch of Proto-New culture, or a distinct identity entirely their own? The answers remain elusive. What is certain is that the Emishi stood at the threshold of Japanese history, neither fully within the state, nor entirely beyond it. They remind us that the making of Japan was not a seamless rise of a single people, but a negotiation between many cultures, some remembered, others forgotten. Today, in the quiet valleys and wind-swept coasts of Tohoku, their legacy lingers in place names, in traditions of horseback archery, and in the faint echoes of stories passed down across a millennium. The Imishi are gone, yet the mystery of who they truly were and what part they played in shaping Japan remains open, awaiting the voices of the land to speak once more. The Okhotski culture far to the north, in the cold seas between Hokkaido, Sakhalin, and the Kuril Islands, there once lived a seafaring people whose legacy drifts like fog over the waters they knew so well. They are remembered, not in chronicles of kings or empires, but in bones, shells, and traces of ritual. Archaeologists call them the Okhotsk culture, a society that thrived from the 5th to the 10th century CE, and whose identity continues to puzzle researchers today. The Okhotsk lived in a harsh yet bountiful environment. Their world was defined by icy currents and rugged coasts, where the Sea of Okhotsk teemed with seals, whales, and fish. Unlike the agrarian societies that spread across the Japanese archipelago to the south, the Okhotsk were maritime hunters, deeply tied to the sea. Excavations of their settlements reveal massive accumulations of seal and sea lion bones, showing the scale of their hunts. Their survival depended on mastery of marine resources, and their culture reflects this intimate bond. Their villages were distinctive along coastal plains and river mouths. The Okhotsk built semi-subterranean houses, insulated against the cold. These dwellings, often circular or oval, clustered together in communities where life revolved around shared hunting and feasting. Within, central hearths warmed families through long winters, while storage pits safeguarded food reserves. Pottery marks another signature of their world. The Okhotsk produced thick-walled vessels, often with impressed decorations and simple, utilitarian forms. Found alongside them are bone tools, harpoons and fishing gear, evidence of a lifestyle oriented toward the sea. Yet iron artifacts also appear, suggesting contact with neighboring cultures and participation in trade networks that extended far beyond their icy coasts. But it is in their rituals that the Okhotsk stand apart. Archaeological sites contain animal burials, especially of dogs and bears, placed with a care that hints at spiritual meaning. Dogs were not only companions in hunting, but may have held sacred status. Bears, too, were revered. Skulls and bones carefully arranged at sites recall ceremonies that later became central in Innu tradition. These practices suggest that the Okhotsk were not only hunters but people whose worldview honored the spirits of the animals they relied upon. Their appearance in the archaeological record raises questions. Where did they come from? Many scholars believe the Okhotsk originated from the north, linked to peoples of the Amur River basin and the Russian Far East. Their material culture, pottery styles, subsistence patterns, and ritual practices shows affinities with these regions. Over time, they spread southward into Hokkaido, where they coexisted and sometimes competed with other cultures such as the Satsuman. This interaction proved significant. In Okhotsk shared land with the Satsuman, an agricultural society influenced by mainland Japan. While the Satsuman cultivated crops, the Okhotsk continued their maritime traditions. The two groups traded, exchanged ideas, and may have intermarried. Out of this fusion, many scholars believe, emerged the foundations of the Ainu people, whose culture would dominate Hokkaido in later centuries. Yet the Okhotsk were not only passive participants in history, they were also agents of expansion. Their seal hunting economies linked them into far-reaching networks. Some evidence suggests trade in furs and marine products with Japan, and possibly even with distant China. Such exchanges hint that the Okhotsk were part of the wider northern world of peoples who bridged Asia and the Pacific. Despite their resilience, by the 10th century the Okhotsk culture began to wane. Pressures from neighboring groups, changes in climate, and the spread of the Satsuman culture likely contributed to their decline. Over generations, their distinct identity faded, absorbed into the cultural mosaic that became the Innu. But their fingerprints remain in ritual, in subsistence, and in the echoes of spiritual traditions passed down across time. Even now, questions linger. Who exactly were the Okhotsk? Were they migrants from Siberia who carved out a niche in Hokkaido, or were they a unique people shaped by the sea itself? How much of their language and worldview endured through the Ainu, and how much was lost to history's silence? In the shell middens and bone piles along Hokkaido's windswept coasts, the Okhotsk whisper their story. They were people of the edge of ice, sea, and forest who lived between worlds, neither fully of Japan nor entirely of Siberia. Their survival depended on the hunt, their rituals honored the spirits of the wild, and their legacy helped shape the indigenous identity of northern Japan. The Okhotsk culture may have disappeared 1,000 years ago, but their shadow lingers in the tides of the northern seas, where every wave seems to carry the memory of hunters who once paddled out, waiting for the seals to surface. The Kofun civilization across the plains of Japan. In the centuries before the rise of emperors and samurai, enormous earth mounds rise from the landscape, silent, imposing, and ancient. These are the Kofun, monumental tombs that gave their name to an entire era of Japanese history. Between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE, they stood as the defining symbols of power, marking the presence of a civilization that shaped the origins of the Japanese state. The Kofun period takes its name from these burial mounds. Some are small, modest circles. Others stretch for hundreds of meters, rivaling the great monuments of the ancient world. The most striking are the keyhole-shaped tombs, with a round rear chamber connected to a square front platform. Their form is unique to Japan, and their scale is staggering. The largest, the Daisen Kofun in Osaka, attributed to Emperor Nintoku, measures nearly half a kilometer in length, longer than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Even today, its full outline is visible only from the sky. But who built these mounds, and what do they reveal about the society that raised them? Archaeology provides clues. Within the Kofun lie stone burial chambers filled with grave goods, bronze mirrors, iron weapons, armor, and ornaments of jade and glass. These objects show not only wealth but connections, trade with China, Korea, and perhaps even lands beyond. The presence of elaborate armor and horse trappings suggests the rise of mounted warriors, foreshadowing Japan's future military elite. Surrounding the tombs stand ranks of clay figures known as hanawa. These hollow terracotta sculptures depict warriors, horses, houses, boats, and even dancers. At once artistic and ritual, they served as guardians of the dead, marking sacred space and reflecting the world of the living. Through them, we glimpse the Kofun society, agricultural villages, warrior elites, religious ceremonies, and the growing complexity of early Japan. The sheer scale of the Kofun points to powerful rulers, chieftains, or kings who commanded vast resources and labor. Building such monuments required not only manpower, but also social organization. Villages had to supply workers, craftsmen, and food for the builders. In this way, the mounds stand as testimony to the emergence of a centralized authority. The beginnings of the Japanese imperial line. The political heart of the Kofun civilization lay in the Yamato region, in present-day Nara prefecture. From here, powerful clans extended their influence across the archipelago. The Yamato leaders allied with Korean kingdoms, adopting technologies such as ironworking and advanced agriculture, and sending envoys to the Chinese courts. In return, they gained prestige and recognition as rulers of a rising state. Yet the Kofun civilization was not only about kings and warriors. Archaeological evidence reveals a broader social fabric. In villages, farmers cultivated rice in irrigated paddies, raised livestock, and crafted tools of wood and iron. Communities engaged in ritual, honoring deities tied to natural forces. The Kofun, while monumental, were not isolated symbols of power. They were woven into a society balancing the spiritual, the martial, and the agricultural. By the 6th century, however, change was underway. The introduction of Buddhism from the Korean peninsula transformed the spiritual and political landscape. Stone statues and temple foundations began to appear, ushering in a new era of belief. At the same time, the building of large Kofun gradually declined. Authority shifted from tomb construction to temple patronage, marking the transition from the Kofun period to the Asuka period. But the mystery of the Kofun endures. Unlike pyramids or ziggurats, most of Japan's great tombs remain untouched, protected by law and imperial decree. The largest, believed to contain the remains of early emperors, are considered sacred and off-limits to excavation. As a result, much about the rulers who lay within remains unknown. What treasures, what inscriptions, what histories might lie sealed inside? The questions linger unanswered. Some scholars suggest that the Kofun marked the emergence of Japan's First true state a unification of clans under the Yamato court. Others see them as symbols of competition among rival chieftains, each mound a claim to legitimacy, where the keyhole shapes meant to link heaven and earth, or to echo foreign influences adapted into a uniquely Japanese form. Without direct evidence, the meanings remain open to interpretation. Even in their silence, the Kofun speak. They tell of a society in transition, from scattered chiefdoms to an organized state, from animistic ritual to Buddhist philosophy, from isolated villages to international diplomacy. They remind us that Japan's origins were not sudden but layered, built through centuries of exchange, adaptation, and ambition. Today, the Kofun still dominate the landscape, covered in trees, surrounded by moats, and encircled by modern cities. They stand as ancient islands of memory. The people who built them are long gone, their names largely forgotten, yet their monuments endure vast, enigmatic, and eternal. Perhaps that is the final mystery of the Kofun civilization, not only how they built such wonders, but why they chose to leave their power written not in words, but in earth. Silent mounds rising against the sky, waiting for us to remember.